How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, no, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a battling stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Good afternoon. We start proceedings today. There was nothing sinister in that cough whatsoever. We start proceedings with time for reflection, and our time for reflection leader is the Reverend Dr. Marjorie McLean, convener, chaplains to Her Majesty's Forces Committee, Church of Scotland.
Presiding Officer, the Hindu festival of Holi began last night and ends today. It's the festival of colours, of spring, of love. It's the day when relationships are mended, laughter is shared, and of course everyone ends up a riot of coloured powder. It's the only festival I know of which you don't just celebrate, you play Holi. Meanwhile, in the church, we are 13 days into Lent, a period of penitence and reflection that is just as far as you could imagine from something you would play. Colour is drained from church buildings, or at least reduced to sombre purple and the grey ash that symbolised Ash Wednesday's quietening of the mood. We who follow Jesus are in our time of self-examination and need-naming. When we reach Easter, the joy will burst out of us because we have been keeping it squashed inside us for all these weeks. So at one and the same time in our Scottish community, we have the celebrations of the joyful and the depths of the subdued mixed up together. Often, in fact, we have those contrasts within a single community, and no one sees that more vividly than the chaplains commissioned in our armed services, both regular and reservist. On a single day, a chaplain may pop in to see children enjoying the facilities in a resource like the newly refurbished Drumfork Community Centre in Helensburgh, and then an hour later be spending time with someone facing a medical board suffering from combat-related PTSD. On a Sunday congregation in a training establishment, a padre may be looking out from the pulpit at a new entry trainee who is terrified of unknown dangers lying ahead in their career, and moments later baptising the baby of someone from nearby service accommodation. And I suspect that as our political representatives, you all know about that too. You are here to enhance the things about Scotland that are worth celebrating, and simultaneously to serve those who most deeply need your voice and your decisions. You try to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And you will never quite be getting it right for some people. Know that as you serve a society full of those tensions, the communities of faith will hold you in our thoughts and our prayers, and most of all, in our thanksgivings.
Thank you. Our next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 21205 in the name of Graeme Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out revisions to this week's business. Could I call on Graeme Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no one has asked to speak against the motion or on the motion, so the question is that motion 21205 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. The next item is topical questions, and we have one question today. It's from Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to concerns raised by the former chair of NHS Lothian regarding the new Royal Hospital for Children and Young People.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
My short response is that I fundamentally disagree with Mr Houston's reported assertions and accusations. The events leading to my decision to halt the transfer are set out in the independent assessment of governance arrangements for the project that was published last autumn. On Thursday, July 4th, 2019, I took the decision that as patient safety could not be guaranteed if the hospital were to open the following week, I instructed a complete halt to the transfer until I could be assured that patient safety in every area of that hospital, including the DCN, met national standards. For the benefit of the Chamber, NHS Lothian's preference at that stage was to attempt to rephase occupation over the following weeks and months, including with DCN moving in as planned and ambulatory paediatric services moving in later in the summer of 2019. The subsequent investigations on the issues to be rectified have demonstrated that such an option would not have been feasible or safe. As a former National Board Chair myself, I did not take this decision lightly. Patient safety, not least those of children, cannot be left to chance. The subsequent support for delivering the project provided as a result by this government of escalating the board to level 4 for the work has put Mary Morgan in to oversee the final delivery of the project to the standard required and within the timeline set. I will, of course, continue to keep the Chamber advised on when the hospital will be opening to serve the people of Lothian.
Miles Briggs.
Cabinet Secretary, in the Edinburgh Evening News interview, the former NHS Lothian chairman paints a worrying picture when he describes a toxic culture, one in which the Cabinet Secretary has presided over, where the board of NHS Lothian has been treated, in his words, with utter contempt. His account raises a fundamental question of trust. To quote, "To come out and say she was overruling NHS Lothian was a lie." Cabinet Secretary, is this version of events correct? And did you actually overrule NHS Lothian?
Cabinet Secretary.
So let me repeat part of what I said in the first answer. On the 3rd of July, the Chief Executive of NHS Lothian sent an email to the Director General of Health and Scottish Government considering 4 potential options and concluded that option 4, rephase the timing of the move into the building to allow a phased occupation over the next few weeks and months, was considered by NHS Lothian as the best option. I did not consider that the best option. I instructed a halt. I think that is clear. I also think it is clear from my dealings with boards across the country and from my actions in this chamber that I am the least likely person to preside over any toxic atmosphere. And I refute that absolutely.
Miles Briggs.
Cabinet Secretary, everything that you've outlined today suggests a dysfunctional relationship between SNP ministers, our health boards and government advisers. Now, in Mr Houston's interview, he says that you threatened if he did not resign, you would fire him. Is that the case?
Cabinet Secretary.
So let me be clear. I do not accept that there is a dysfunctional relationship between the Scottish Government, NHS boards, or any of NHS Directorate staff and NHS boards, and I do not believe the reported assertions and accusations of Mr Houston, which I am clearly refuting and providing evidence to back that, in any way indicates substantive evidence for your assertion, Mr Briggs. In terms of what Mr Houston says, Mr Houston, I took the decision on the 4th of July to halt the move. Mr Houston next met me on the 18th of July. At no point in that intervening period did the chair of that major national board feel it was incumbent upon him to contact me as the Cabinet Secretary in order to discuss what may have gone wrong, what should be done now, and where the board should be involved. Nonetheless, the Director General of NHS Scotland was in contact with the Chief Executive and matters were being discussed. Matters are continuously discussed between the Director General, our National Clinical Director, our Chief Medical Officer, our various directors in NHS, and indeed tomorrow I will be attending a meeting of the NHS Chief Execs, as I attend meetings of the NHS chairs on a regular basis. So I do not accept that there is a dysfunctional relationship in any respect. What I do accept is that it is my job to challenge boards, to support them, to ensure that we get the best performance for the investment. In terms of whether or not I said to Mr Houston that I would sack him, Mr Houston resigned. I have powers under the Act to dismiss chairs. I did not use those powers in this instance.
Monica Lennon, to be followed by Angela Constance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The dominant issue of coronavirus is presenting a public health emergency, and we're about to hear from the Cabinet Secretary on that matter. And we've all committed to work with the Scottish Government in the public interest, but it's clear that this issue around NHS Lothian and the resignation of Brian Houston is not an issue that's going away, and we can't have it swept under the carpet. So will the Cabinet Secretary agree to publish all of the emails and minutes of the discussions that she's referred to, and anything else that would help bring this to a close? And if we don't get the answers that we need, will she commit to a ministerial statement next week so that all members in the chamber can have more time to explore this in full?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I don't believe in any respect that I am attempting to sweep anything under the carpet, and indeed it would have been my wish to publish the appraisal that Mr Houston disputes, and is clear in his response that he disputes that appraisal and its conclusions, but GDPR prevents me from doing so. That is the basis. GDPR is not something that I made up. It is not something I control. It exists, and it prevents me from doing so. But what also prevents me from doing so is the relationship that it is critical that I have with board chairs and chief execs, and my Director General has with those individuals too. So I have set out clearly what happened on the 3rd of July, what I did on the 4th of July, and how it took Mr Houston until the 18th of July to have a conversation with me, which only happened because I visited the Sick Kids Hospital in Edinburgh. Now, I do not know what more Ms Lennon wants to pursue in this matter, but let me say clearly, the people who are keeping this alive are on these benches and on these benches. No one else from NHS Lothian, from the staff involved in those two hospitals, have raised any concerns whatsoever with me in this regard, and that includes the Area Partnership Forum, who represent the staff across all the unions with whom we have been actively engaged. I believe that we have acted properly. I have acted properly. I have set out very clearly how those accusations by Mr Houston are wrong, why I will not publish his appraisal, which he founds on all of this, and I now believe that if we are genuinely focused on the right health service for Scotland and on addressing the challenge of coronavirus, then this matter should now be ended by members of the opposition who simply want to make political capital from it.
Okay, we've had a good exploration of this, but I've got 6 more questioners and I would like to get through them. We'll have brief questions and brief answers too, please. Angela Constance to be followed by Neil Findlay. Angela Constance.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. As the constituency MSP for Amond Valley, I very much appreciate the plain-speaking approach that the Cabinet Secretary takes in standing up for patients and staff. So, recognising that the Health Secretary made a call to postpone NHS Lothian's planned move in the interests of patient safety at a time which has now been publicly acknowledged no decision had been taken by the board, can the Cabinet Secretary elaborate more on what work is now underway to oversee the safe delivery of the new hospital?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the board was escalated to level 4 for this particular piece of work. Mary Morgan is the director that we have put into the board from government in order to work with the health board to oversee all the works that need done to ensure that the new hospital is safe and meets standards, particularly with respect to ventilation, electrics and fire safety. We are moving on. The timeline has not changed from when I first announced it, so I am hopeful that we will be able to announce shortly the move of DCN into its new facilities at the new site, and that we will then continue the work in order to be able to open the hospital in the autumn of this year.
Neil Findlay to be followed by Alison Johnson.
Cabinet Secretary, it's our job to hold you to account on behalf of our constituents, and we will do that whether you like it or not. Can I say this? GDPR does not prevent you from publishing emails, letters, minutes and agendas from any meetings. So will you now publish them all?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, of course, you hold me to account, Mr Findlay, and you do it with regularity, and I welcome it every time. What I said about GDPR related to the appraisal. However, if you wish to see the email from the board that I quoted from and other exchanges around that time, then I am very happy to publish those and to make those available to members.
Alison Johnson to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary doesn't agree that the relationship is dysfunctional, but it certainly appears that the relationship between NHS Lothian and the Scottish Government has been damaged. And I'd like to understand what action the Cabinet Secretary intends taking to restore the essential trust that must exist between the Health Board and ministers. And in light of Mr Houston publicly expressing such serious concerns about the relationship, will the Cabinet Secretary be meeting with Mr Houston himself or others to explore the concerns so that we can avoid any future breakdown in this really important relationship?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, Mr Houston's resignation came as a result of the appraisal that he received from the Director-General of the NHS in Scotland. Standard practice. And I'm sure, like others in this chamber, I know that appraisals sometimes can be uncomfortable. And clearly, Mr Houston found that to be the case and did not accept the conclusion of that appraisal. I do not accept, on the basis of that, that the relationship between this government, the Health Directorate, myself, the DG or any of my senior officials and NHS Lothian is damaged on the basis solely of one individual's resignation and their personal decision to go to the press and make a number of accusations and assertions which I refute. Our relationship with NHS Lothian continues to be a productive, supportive and, yes, at times challenging one, and that is as it should be.
Sarah Boyack to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Cabinet Secretary, has the opening date of the sick kids been confirmed and agreed by NHS Lothian? I ask because we had a recent cross-party briefing from senior staff where the date was not confirmed.
Cabinet Secretary.
As I said earlier, the timeline that I set out, which was to move DCN into the new facilities in the spring this year and for the hospital to open in the autumn, remains on track. Specific dates require to be finalised. As we progress that work, the ventilation, the new upgrade to ventilation and the other matters go in. And as soon as we have a specific date for both of those, I will happily return to the Chamber or advise members by email of those.
Thank you. Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The cloud under which all of this sits is the reality that a hospital lies empty, costing £1.4 million a month, bereft of patients. Given that communication has been at the heart of some of the problems we've discussed today, what confidence does the Cabinet Secretary have that she is receiving now accurate communication from NHS Lothian around the hospital, that she can then impart with regularity to this Parliament?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, the climate that actually surrounds all this is not simply that we have a hospital lying empty, but that we had a hospital that was not safe. That is the fundamental point. And if I have no other job as a Cabinet Secretary, it is to protect patient safety. And that is what I did. In terms of the information, as I've said, we have Mary Morgan from the Scottish Government working with NHS Lothian. She reports to an oversight board chaired by our Chief Nursing Officer, and the information from that board is regularly communicated to me in terms of progress that is being made in order to ensure that the timeline I've outlined is met.
And Daniel Johnson.
The Cabinet Secretary did not deny threatening to dismiss Mr Houston. If so, can the Cabinet Secretary confirm what grounds she believes she had for issuing such an ultimatum?
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Houston chose to resign. I chose not to use my ministerial powers. This all arose, as I've said already, from an appraisal, and as I've said, we all accept that they can be uncomfortable, but they are an important part of how we conduct our work with our chief executives, with our chairs, and indeed we expect our chairs to do that with non-execs. Now, if Mr Houston or any other chair does not accept any accountability for the situation that NHS Lothian finds itself in at level 3 for performance and other matters, despite having significant additional resources and support put into it, at level 4 for a hospital which, on the grounds of patient safety, had to be halted in the move into it days before that was due, then Mr Houston has a different idea of the role of chair than I do, or than I acted upon when I was the chair of a national board. What I expect from our chairs is very clear. They require our support, they require our challenge, but they also require to accept their accountability for the performance of the board that they chair. That is the situation we were in. Mr Houston did not accept that. He did not accept the conclusions of his appraisal. In that situation, where someone does not accept that more work could be done, then it is very difficult for us to continue in that productive relationship. In those circumstances, Mr Houston chose to resign.
Thank you very much, and that concludes topical questions. And we'll move on in just 1 second to the next item of business. A short pause.
Cabinet Secretary, because the next item of business is a statement by Jean Freeman on Ministry on novel, why do I call it novel? I'm not French. Novel coronavirus, COVID-19. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, so if you have no interventions or interruptions. I call on Jean Freeman, Cabinet Secretary, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, COVID-19 is presenting a profound and escalating challenge to countries around the world. The situation is extremely fast-moving, but I want to try and keep this chamber as up-to-date as is practicable. As of 9 a.m. this morning, there have been a total of 27 confirmed cases of COVID-19 infections in Scotland, an increase of 4 since yesterday. All cases identified in Scotland either have a relevant travel history or are infections through contact with known cases, with 19 cases being related to travel history to Category 2 countries, with the majority from North Italy, and 8 through personal contact. We are also carrying out enhanced surveillance in the community through our GP Sentinel network, in intensive care units and our acute hospitals, but to date no cases have been identified through this means. This means that we have no evidence yet of community transmission, so we remain in the containment phase. As I set out last week following the publication of the UK-wide Coronavirus Action Plan, it is important that our approach continues to be guided by clear scientific and clinical evidence routed through the Chief Medical Officers via the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE. As members will recall, there are 3 distinct phases to managing this outbreak, namely contain, which is the phase that we are in now, delay, the steps that need to be taken to flatten the peak number of cases and protect the most vulnerable, and mitigate. There was a COBRA meeting yesterday, which I attended with our First Minister, where these matters were discussed across the 4 nations, and there will be a further COBRA meeting tomorrow. The First Minister has also been chairing our Scottish Government resilience meetings to ensure a cross-government response, and one that goes wider than the health service, but covers all of Scotland's public services, business and tourism sectors. As I've said, we, like England, Wales and Northern Ireland, remain in the containment phase, but we can expect to move relatively soon to delay when we begin to see cases transmitted in the community. Our goal is to protect life, not least those of the most vulnerable in our society. All of our actions to date and to come are with that goal in mind. The timing of moving into the delay phase and what measures are judged to be the most effective in that phase must be and are driven very firmly by scientific and clinical advice. Understandably, people will be looking to the situation in other countries and questioning why some of the moves they are taking are not being made here yet, in Scotland or in the UK. I have to let the Chamber know that no measure has been ruled out, and the actions we take may develop over time and may be added to as we seek to manage the impact of the infection and protect life. If the actions we take can flatten the infection curve, we will give our NHS the best chance to be able to treat the sickest patients to the very best of its ability. The timing of actions, guided by the scientific evidence, is being tailored to have the maximum impact on flattening that infection curve. Timing is critical. If we take those measures too soon, we will not have the impact we need. If we take them too late, we will not reduce demand to the level required. It is no exaggeration, Presiding Officer, to say that continuing with simple measures like hand washing and sneezing etiquette could help the reduction of the infection spread and, as a result, help save lives. To prevent the worst impacts of this virus, it will need not just action across our government, but action across our society. And we all need to be clear that while for the vast majority this will be a virus with mild symptoms, for many it will be a serious illness that is potentially life-threatening. I am aware that the steps that we may have to take in the coming weeks will have an impact on the normal day-to-day lives we lead. Anything we do will be carefully considered in line with evidence, backed with clear guidance and supported. It will also be clearly explained in this chamber and to the wider public. Work is already in hand to ensure the health and social care sector is as ready as it can be for any increase in cases. This includes work to scale up NHS 24 to enable telephone consultation should there be restrictions placed on people's ability to visit their GP or practice nurse. We are working with the professional regulators to establish urgent arrangements to allow us to bring back recently retired nurses and others if they are willing to do so. And work is also in hand to explore how we might use students who are close to finishing their training in nursing and in medicine to allow them to be registered temporarily to support our efforts if needed. We are also accelerating our NHS Near Me provision with immediate investment of £1.24 million to ensure that we can support the video consultations, which will be essential to help us to reduce face-to-face contact, and that will be necessary should there be significant increases in the need for self-isolation. This is a rapid scaling up of these services that have previously been used largely in rural areas, but will now become more common in our urban settings too. I have also taken the decision to postpone the annual NHS event, not because it is a large event, but because our hard-working frontline staff need to be able to focus their collective efforts on responding to this virus. So this is simply about not placing additional demand on our staff. Presiding Officer, I want to again put on record my sincere thanks and appreciation to all the staff within the health and social care sector who have and continue to be working incredibly hard in both responding to this evolving and dynamic situation and continuing to discharge the high-quality care the NHS Scotland is renowned for. But I also want to thank all members of the public for their support in following the advice of hand washing and use of tissues and on contacting NHS 24 or their GP if they have symptoms. They are acting to protect themselves and their families, but they are also acting to protect all of us. This has to be a societal response. I'm grateful to members for the support they have shown so far. I will continue to update this chamber as quickly as is practically possible, and I'm very happy, Presiding Officer, to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary now take questions on a statement of about 20 minutes. I call Miles Briggs, be followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you,
Mr.
Deputy
Briggs,
Presiding Officer. And can I start by thanking the Cabinet Secretary for advanced sight of her statement and also for the manner in which she's been keeping opposition parties briefed on this important matter. Can I ask two specific questions? Firstly, in relation to bed capacity in our NHS. What further progress has been made over the last week to increase beds in every hospital across Scotland? And specifically, have ministers received any concerns from NHS staff with regards to equipment capacity, and also have any unions made these representatives as well?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I'm grateful to Mr Briggs. A lot of work is going on in terms of how, what steps we might take to increase bed capacity in our health service, looking not only at our acute settings but secondary and community settings as well. And that includes looking at what we need to do and what is possible to do to increase our intensive care units as well. As Mr Briggs will know, the primary treatment for those who are most ill from coronavirus is high-flow oxygen therapy, which will either be administered externally or through ventilator systems. The proportion from the evidence elsewhere appears to be shifting about what proportion of one or the other is needed. All of that is getting factored in. The work that is underway involves directly all of our NHS boards. And our boards are involving all of their area partnership forums. We were in direct contact with the senior Scottish representatives of all the unions involved in our NHS. And again, I co-signed a letter from the chair of the National Partnership Forum to staff, because it is absolutely vital that they continue to be involved. In terms of equipment, there will be a need for additional equipment. The scale-up of Attend Anywhere involves the provision of additional equipment, and we have authorised that expenditure. The additional equipment is a UK-wide issue, and so we are looking to address it in a UK-wide basis and not get into some kind of competition. The four-nation approach has been very effective so far, and we are very keen to continue with that.
Monica Lennon, followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I also thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement and for her regular updates in the Chamber and out with the art. Appreciated. Some concerns have been raised with me about testing for the virus, with some people who have a relevant travel history presenting with symptoms but being told that they are not viewed as a risk and don't need to be tested. So could you provide further clarity on when people can expect to be tested for COVID-19 and if further work is ongoing to ensure that testing will be widely available to those who need it and on a consistent basis. She'll recall I asked last week about NHS 24 capacity, so I appreciate the announcement about scaling up NHS 24. Can you say more about that, and will that include overtime or redeployment? And lastly, can I ask what discussions are taking place with the Scottish Drug Death Task Force and others to look at the particular needs of people who have substance misuse issues, who might be rough sleeping, who might be homeless and who need access to medication and might struggle to self-isolate at this time? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
In terms of testing for the virus, it is a clinical decision that is taken through a conversation between a clinically qualified individual and the person concerned. They go through a number of questions and the clinician decides whether or not the individual's description of their symptoms meets the case definition for COVID-19, and at that point testing is instigated. So testing is widely available where those clinical decisions indicate that it is required. And as you know, we have 2 testing centres in Scotland now, in Glasgow and Edinburgh, with Tayside ready to scale up should that be needed, and Glasgow now taking on the confirmatory testing, as well as Colindale down south. That's the issue around testing. If individuals have concern, in terms of NHS 24, we have 2 numbers. One is 111 for out of hours, where you have, you believe you may have symptoms and you want to go through that exercise with the clinician at the other end of the line. The other is a free helpline number, which I will give for you in one moment. And that is, if you like, for those individuals who are a bit worried, a bit unsure about what they should do. It can be confusing about what's the best thing to do. Then phoning the NHS 24 free number 0800 028 2816. Happy to send that. I will write to all MSPs later today and I will include that number in the letter. Is there as well for people to make contact. In terms of scaling up, that includes additional staff being recruited, as well as working with staff to look at additional shifts, patterns and so on. Being mindful that we are in this exercise for the long haul. So we need to be taking care of our staff as well as them taking care of others, and we are very mindful of that. In terms of vulnerable groups, there are vulnerable groups in a health sense, but there are vulnerable groups otherwise, as Ms Lennon says, and Mr Fitzpatrick this morning had a meeting specifically with respect to how we get that health reach to those suffering from drug addiction.
Thank you. 11 members wishing to ask questions, about 15 minutes, and really everybody deserves to get the question asked, so be disciplined with your questions. Emma Harper, followed by Alison Johnson.
Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm whether the experts who are providing the scientific advice to the Scottish Government and the UK Government are learning from experiences elsewhere, not least in Italy, who are clearly seeing the impacts of a significant infection outbreak?
Thank you, Ms Harper. That's how to do it. Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I can. The modelling that I described last week when I made a statement was primarily at that point using data from China. That modelling is a continuous exercise and now factors in more data from Italy, but also from elsewhere in Europe.
Alison Johnson, followed by Alistair Allen.
I previously asked the Cabinet Secretary what action was being taken to support people on insecure contracts who may receive no payment at all if they're forced to self-isolate. The Cabinet Secretary in her previous role will be only too well aware that the UK Government have advised that people apply for universal credit if they find themselves in this situation. But considering the assessment process which must be completed, not to mention the 5-week wait, this won't be practical. So what further assurance can the Cabinet Secretary provide that people on 0 hours contracts or insecure work won't be forced to take this course of action or face not being paid?
Cabinet Secretary. Don't know if that's one for you, but...
So in the COBRA meetings and with colleagues at the UK level of the UK Government, there have been discussions ongoing with DWP with specific reference to universal credit and how the conduct of universal credit can be altered in order to avoid individuals being forced to make a decision between what is right for their health and that of their families, but also in terms of their income. In addition, my colleague Ms Somerville, as Ms Johnson will know, Cabinet Secretary for Social Security, has given active thought with the Social Security Agency about those benefits that we are responsible for and what additional work can be done there, but is also looking at what further the Scottish Government could do by way of helping to mitigate financial problems for people in terms of those insecure contracts that Ms Johnson is referring to.
Alistair Allen, followed by Alec Cole-Hamilton.
Can the Cabinet Secretary say more about how, in the coming weeks and months, the Scottish Government and UK Government will maintain regular dialogue on developments with COVID-19 and how the important information discussed within that forum can be communicated to the public on a regular basis?
Cabinet Secretary.
The primary way in which that happens is through the COBRA meetings. There have recently been 2 each week, chaired by now by the Prime Minister. Often the second one is chaired by the Secretary of State for Health, Mr Hancock, and that is the primary way in which the 2 governments, with our colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland, also as part of that, are discussing issues based on the scientific and clinical advice and reviewing what more we collectively believe needs to be done. In addition, of course, our officials, including our Deputy Chief Medical Officer, our Chief Medical Officer, our Chief Pharmacist and others are in daily contact with their counterparts elsewhere in the United Kingdom in order to ensure that we are as aligned as possible in terms of the decisions that we take going forward. In terms of communicating that to the wider public, we have had the Chief Medical Officer, our National Clinical Advisor, our First Minister, myself, regularly taking up all opportunities offered to us through national broadcast and print media. We will continue to do that, and I will continue to look for every possible opportunity to update this chamber, members directly, and the party spokespeople and leaders, as we have done up until now.
Alec Cole-Hamilton, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. Given that COVID-19 seems to affect older people disproportionately, both in terms of infection and severity, and that many older Scots live alone without necessarily access to internet and as such NHS near me, what provision is the government making for older Scots who might be already socially isolated if they become sick in terms of treatment and testing?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the evidence so far indicates that those who are most at risk of contracting the virus and experiencing a serious illness are those in their 70s and 80s, but also individuals who have particular vulnerabilities in terms of their health, largely speaking, those who are immune suppressed. And as we move into the delay phase, we will set out very clearly what those conditions are and what we are asking people to do. Of course, the whole resilience approach in terms of Scotland also includes our regional resilience partnerships. They have been stood up now for some days. That includes local government, as well as fire and police and health. But local government is critical here in the support that it can offer to those older people, as is our third sector. And of course, my colleague Ms Somerville and Ms McKelvey are actively looking at what more can we do to ensure that the necessary steps are put in place to support older people, particularly those who live alone and are isolated either in terms of their social contacts or in terms of their geography.
Stuart McMillan, followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the Cabinet Secretary has made clear, people have got the vital role to play in helping us contain any outbreak by following the latest health and travel advice. And can the Cabinet Secretary reiterate the best places for the public to access advice on travelling at home and also abroad?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the 2 places that are key to advice in terms of travel and travel restrictions is the Foreign and Commonwealth Office website, which will keep people up to date on their very specific advice on travel. And in terms of our response and a whole range of other questions that people may have, the NHS Inform website, as well as that free helpline number, is where people should go for continuously updated advice, which also relates to the travel advice from the FCO.
Brian Whittle, followed by David Stewart.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. If I could raise a constituency issue with a pharmacy who, in replenishing their stock, have reported to me that they've been charged 3 times the usual cost for medicines such as paracetamol. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if she's aware of other instances such as this, and what can the Scottish Government do to ensure that ethical practices, if I can put it that way, continue through this crisis?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I'd be very grateful to know the detail of that from Mr Whittle and any other such instance that arises from any member. As Mr Whittle and I were discussing only this morning in the committee, he will understand the interrelationship between devolved and reserved powers. So I will make sure that once I have those details, that my officials are raising that with their counterparts south of the border to see what we can do to ensure that unethical practices, really quite disgraceful practices, if this is the case, are prevented as far as it is possible for us to do that. Presiding Officer, if I may just take this opportunity to factually update the Chamber, I understand that the COBRA meeting will now take place on Thursday and not tomorrow.
Thank you very much. I call David Stewart, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline the Scottish Government's strategy for the final stage of dealing with the coronavirus, which is the mitigation phase, particularly with reference to intensive care beds, which are in short supply relative to our European neighbours, such as Italy?
Cabinet Secretary.
So our current number of intensive care beds are proportionately the same across the UK. But as Mr Stewart quite rightly identifies, the evidence tells us that those who will be most seriously affected are likely to require, for some, intensive care beds. And so part of the work that we are undertaking that I described to Mr Briggs in terms of looking at bed capacity across the whole estate also looks at doubling our intensive care beds and ensuring that we have the right trained staff and the right equipment in order to be able to do that. Now, we will continue to look at what more can we do to maximise our capacity to respond to this at the same time as we are taking the steps to flatten that peak so that we give ourselves the best possible chance to be able to do so. But nonetheless, I think all of us need to understand that the situation is a serious one, that whilst many people will be mildly affected, for some this will be a serious infection, and for many it will potentially cause their death.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary set out what approach residential care homes should be taking to protect residents and staff, and what precautions they should be taking in relation to visitors?
Cabinet Secretary.
So in terms of precautions, residential care homes should be ensuring that visitors as well as their own staff and their residents follow that very straightforward public health advice that we have been encouraging people to follow up until now as part of the containment phase and indeed beyond that, and that is hand washing, use of tissues and making sure that if anyone has any symptoms that they are concerned about, that call is made to the local GP surgery or to NHS 24. In terms of future work going forward, the planning that is underway now, that is clearly work that we undertake directly with our colleagues in COSLA. We are looking with the residential care sector at what additional clinical expertise they might need in the community and what additional training their staff may need in order to deliver what I would describe, although it is an old-fashioned term I accept, as barrier nursing. I think most people will understand what that means. It's basic nursing precautions in terms of preventing infection spread. So that work is underway with COSLA and with the care home sector in order to make sure that we are planning and put in place what we need at the right time.
Liz Smith, followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Could I ask the Cabinet Secretary what measures the Government can take to support our more vulnerable adults and young people who are perhaps not able to read some of the information or to be able to comprehend it in the ways that other people can?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much. It's a very important question, and my colleague Ms Hockey advises me that we are looking at that, particularly for people with learning disabilities. We are also, through colleagues elsewhere in government, reaching out to ensure that carers have the support that they need. This is an anxious time for them in terms of those that they care for, but also anxiety if they themselves become ill, and therefore who will care for the individual that they are caring for. So all of that work is underway, and I would intend, as soon as it is possible and practical to do, to come back to the Chamber and update members on all of that.
Rona Mackay, followed by Mary Fee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, in response to a question on testing at airports, the UK Government Health Secretary stated that the evidence from other countries that have tried temperature testing at airports shows it's not effective, can actually be counterproductive to the effort because it leads to a lot of false positives. Does the Scottish Government's scientific advice concur with this view of airport testing, and is the Cabinet Secretary content with the approach being taken at Scotland's airports at present?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, we are, and it does. Only a third of those infected by coronavirus demonstrate that infection by way of a spike in their temperature. So one of the difficulties with screening arrivals at airports is that you will miss people because they are not showing an increase in their temperature, and you have then false reassurance. So that is why screening at airports, and based on the scientific and clinical advice we have, is not the right precaution for us to take.
And Mary Fee.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for the update on the increase in intensive care beds, but can the Cabinet Secretary assure the Chamber that additional intensive care staff will be in place as bed capacity increases?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much. It's a very important question. What we are looking at just now, and I should stress to members that whilst I am not bringing you absolute conclusions here, I want you to be assured that this work is going on day and daily and has been for some time. What we are looking at now is the skilled staff that we do have, who are not intensive care staff, but who could, with some additional training, take on some of those roles, whilst leaving our highly specialised intensive care staff to do the things that only they are qualified to do. What that means is, in practical terms, is that as far as it is possible within the bounds of patient safety and good clinical care, the current model in normal time of how you would deliver care in an intensive care unit will have to shift a bit in order to allow us to cope with more people in intensive care beds with the maximum clinical input and the maximum patient safety.
Thank you. That concludes questions on coronavirus. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and all members that's been managed to get all questioners in due to your own self-discipline. And we'll now briefly move on to the next statement. The next item of business is a statement by Rosanna Cunningham on COP26, our contribution to global climate action. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, so there will be no interventions and interruptions. I'll call on the Cabinet Secretary, please.
Presiding Officer, COP26 is a critical moment in the global fight against climate change. Tackling the climate crisis and setting the world on course to net zero within a generation will require a truly international response. The UK Government themes for engaging at COP are adaptation and resilience, nature, energy transition, clean road, transport and finance. Climate action is central to the work of the Scottish Government and foregrounded in the aims of business, civil society, academia, industry, youth movements and many others. And this inclusive approach is reflected in Scotland's themes for COP, just transition and people. In Scotland, we have already demonstrated we are committed to delivering world-leading action to tackle the climate crisis. Our landmark Climate Change Act commits us to a 75% emissions reduction target by 2030 and net zero by 2045, which are in line with the Paris Agreement's requirements for nationally determined contributions to reducing emissions by 2030 and beyond. Building momentum towards COP26, our national endeavour to tackle climate change provides a platform for increased global action. Our budget sets out ambitious new measures responding to the global climate emergency. It includes low-carbon investment of around £1.8 billion in 2020-2021, an increase of over £500 million compared with 2019-20. Equally welcome is the £250 million committed to restoring peatlands over the next 10 years, truly a game-changer. The Year of Coasts and Waters is an appropriate theme as we journey towards COP. Communities and business across Scotland will showcase our natural environment and wildlife, those elements which are most iconic but also most vulnerable to climate change. And last week, we introduced a Heat Networks Bill, which will help us meet our climate change targets by regulating heat networks, by increasing investor, supply chain and consumer awareness and acceptance. The Scottish Renewables Conference in March and All Energy Conference in May will showcase both government and industry action to decarbonise the energy sector. The updated climate change plan will be laid in Parliament by the end of April. This demonstrates the increased intensity and pace of activity we will need to move us towards net zero. In the same month, we will also host an online international biodiversity workshop seeking to amplify the voices of subnational governments and ensure concrete action is taken on the twin challenges of biodiversity loss and climate change. In May, the Under 2 Coalition, of which Scotland is a proud member, will celebrate its 5th anniversary. We plan to work with this coalition to showcase the action of subnational governments during COP. Recognising that increased investment needed for the net zero transition is a key part of our action around COP26, we will seek to capitalise on the opportunities this brings. The Scottish National Investment Bank, with its primary mission of a just transition to net zero, is an example of innovative green finance. We are also identifying large-scale investment opportunities suitable for the global market, helping private sector financing become an integrated part of Scotland's net zero transition. Last month, the Independent Just Transition Commission published their interim report highlighting the requirement to put equity at the heart of policy making. Across this year, we will continue to work with the Commission to understand how the net zero transition can create jobs and prosperity, reduce pollution and waste, and improve people's well-being. In summer, we will publish a heat decarbonisation statement, setting out the steps needed to reduce the emissions associated with heating our homes and buildings. In September, we plan to host an international land reform conference. Land use is a fundamental part of tackling the climate crisis, and we are working to ensure that everyone can benefit fairly from Scotland's land. And Scotland's annual Climate Week will take place on 14th to 20th September, and our Climate Citizens Assembly will meet for the first time in autumn. This is an important forum as we consider the far-reaching change needed across society and is an example of the way in which people can have their say on climate action. Presiding Officer, COP26 can act as a catalyst to drive forward action by business, industry, local authorities, communities and many others. Our focus is on securing a legacy that puts decarbonisation at the forefront of people's thinking. That has been central to our discussions with Glasgow City Council, and I have discussed directly with the Council leader how we ensure NGOs, businesses and wider communities are able to get involved. We encourage all partners to seize the opportunity of COP26 to show the best of what Scotland has to offer. Our COP26 platform must be inclusive, involving all sectors. An event that everyone can feel a part of, providing opportunities for young people, communities and representatives from the Global South to engage. Glasgow has an excellent reputation for hosting large-scale international events. We are working closely with our delivery partners to ensure Scotland delivers a world-class, safe, secure and successful COP. The First Minister and I have written to the new COP President offering our support. While I've not yet met with Alok Sharma, I do hope to meet him when he visits Glasgow. To demonstrate our commitment to shared working, we have welcomed the opportunity to deploy Scottish Government staff in the COP Blue Zone following initial discussions with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Presiding Officer, there has been significant media coverage of COP-related cost estimates. These cost estimates will be further refined once the UK provides additional information on planning assumptions. As a result of updated information, the Scottish Police Authority has already revised its estimate for the policing costs to £180 million. The figure is subject to change to reflect evolving operational planning and will also be subject to ongoing review and scrutiny. This additional information has also reduced the cost estimates to the health, transport and justice systems by around £40 million. And I hope that as further detail becomes available from the UK, it will be possible to further refine those costs. I think it's also important to update Parliament on the partnership with the Glasgow Science Centre that I set out to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee on 26 November 2019. That partnership was intended to provide a space where the public, business, universities and NGOs could engage with delegates on what is happening in Scotland and to learn more about climate action. In recent weeks, we have become aware that the UK Government wishes to use the Glasgow Science Centre as a COP green zone. At their request, we have responded positively to proposals to share the Science Centre. However, I've learnt that in a recent communication with Glasgow Science Centre, the UK Government indicated that the opportunity to share the space was no longer available to us, placing the Science Centre in a very difficult position and creating significant uncertainty. We have no desire for this uncertainty to continue. Our position has always been that the climate emergency and COP26 should transcend politics. As a consequence, and in the spirit of partnership, today I have written again to the COP26 President to offer to transfer the control of the Science Centre during COP26 to the UK Government. I have made it clear that this offer is provisional on the Scottish Government being offered an appropriate alternative venue in Glasgow to allow us to showcase Scotland. I have urged the UK Government to conclude this matter without delay. We can then continue to collaborate with the UK Government, Glasgow City Council and our partners to showcase Scotland to the world at this pivotal conference. There have, of course, been questions in recent weeks as to the impact of coronavirus on COP26. I want to assure members that we continue to plan for COP26 to take place, and while advice will evolve, we are continuing to plan on the basis that COP will take place in Scotland. We will, of course, inform Parliament should there be any substantial change in those assumptions. Presiding Officer, we want to use the opportunity of COP26 as a catalyst to attract new investment, innovation and sustainable economic growth for Scotland. We will further harness the will and ambition of the Scottish Government and the Scottish people, firmly positioning Scotland as the world leader it is in tackling climate change.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the statement. We have until about 3:20, so I call Annie Wells, followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement. I welcome the work the Scottish Government is doing to tackle climate change. Scotland and the UK have some of the most ambitious targets in the world, and I look forward to working with the Cabinet Secretary so we can make sure these targets are met. In that light, I'm glad to see the Cabinet Secretary offer the use of the Science Centre to the UK Government, although I have a few questions about the ongoing relationship between Scotland's governments. First of all, could the Cabinet Secretary confirm that this is the only building where there is a dispute between the UK and Scottish governments? And secondly, when the Cabinet Secretary says that she's expected to be offered an appropriate alternative venue, is this being expected to be offered by the UK Government? And finally, can the Cabinet Secretary agree that these disputes between Scotland's governments won't help us tackle climate change? And we need to see the UK and Scottish Governments working together if COP26 is going to be a success.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, working together is what will make COP26 a success, and that is what we are endeavouring to do. I didn't use the word dispute, I would use the word conversation, which is currently taking place about the future of the Science Centre. I would hope and expect that the Scottish Government will be able to secure an alternative venue from whatever source one becomes available. I think everybody in this chamber will accept and agree that there needs to be a place for the Scottish Government to be able to host and offer to others the use of that venue in order to ensure that all aspects of the climate change challenge in the United Kingdom and globally are actually met. That is what this is all about.
Can I just remind members, you want to ask a question, you need to press your button to ask it. Claudia Beamish, followed by Sandra White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer.
You can press your button, Ms Beamish. Don't take that personally.
Okay, actually, okay. So I welcome the Scottish Government's theme, Just Transition and People. These are fundamental considerations for Scotland and for abroad in the shift to net zero and the global negotiations. Given this theme, and the Scottish Labour Amendment to the Climate Change Act, requiring ministers, I quote, to support people who are most affected by climate change but who have done least to cause it and are least equipped to adapt to its effects. I welcome comment from the Cabinet Secretary on the following. Will the Cabinet Secretary consider committing today to implementing the Just Transition Commission interim recommendations to prevent any further delay? And will she also consider the possibility of further funding to the Climate Justice Fund in the light of the growing scale and depth of the climate impacts on the Global South? The mechanisms for innovative green finance are vital here and globally, as she recognises, of course. And how is the Scottish Government working with the COP President to ensure equity of influence at COP26 so that marginalised voices have the same lobbying and access opportunities as wealthy industries?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Claudia for her question, and her enduring commitment to these issues meant that I could rather have anticipated that she would go into this particular area, quite rightly. We are currently looking at all the Just Transition Commission recommendations, the interim recommendations, and we will be returning and advising Parliament as to our timetable for implementation or otherwise. The climate justice funding issue, of course, is a very important one. We do already provide funding for climate justice work, and you know, our continued commitment to doing that, of course, is in the face of there not actually being an easy fund from which to draw that money, but we do find it and we are increasing it. It's distributed primarily through the Climate Challenge Programme Malawi and the Climate Justice Innovation Fund, which funds projects in Malawi, Zambia and Rwanda. So we try to keep that very focused. I hope the member will accept that that continued focus, given the relatively modest amount of money that we spend, is probably the best way for us to actually achieve some result. The issue of climate justice, however, is incredibly important. And I know at COP25 in Madrid, I was approached by a number of people from what might be roughly termed the Global South, about their desire to become much more actively involved at all level of COP, the COP proceedings. And I have undertaken to try and be at least an amplifier for that demand. As the member will have heard in my statement, the new president has only just been in place for a very short number of weeks. I haven't had the opportunity to speak directly to him, although, as indicated, there are exchanges of letters. It is one of the issues that I will want to continue to raise with the UK government, because I think it will be a very important marker for COP26 that those voices are heard.
11 members, 13 minutes. So the usual mantra, please. You'll give the first example. Sandra White, I hope, followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, COP26, which takes place in my Kelvin constituency, will want to be one of the biggest events hosted in the UK and require much additional resources to deliver a safe and secure event. Has the Cabinet Secretary had any indication whatsoever from the UK Government that will provide Police Scotland with additional resources required?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as a member will be aware, this is not entirely lying within my portfolio, but there have obviously been very serious discussions in respect of Police Scotland. As I understand it, some of the policing support will be brought in under existing agreements, so there will be police from other parts of the United Kingdom being brought to reinforce and support what is happening. But our view is always that the decision to hold the COP in Scotland was a UK decision. Therefore, the costs of that, the core costs of that, should be borne by the UK government, and that must include funding for police. Because obviously the most important thing for us to do is to deliver a safe, secure and successful event. And that extends to fire and ambulance services as well. I do welcome the assurance that there is a process in place to provide scrutiny of financial costs, and I expect that to be ongoing. It will evolve as we get closer, as we understand more clearly what is going to be required.
Mark Ruskell, followed by Bill Kidd.
Previous summits have been heavily sponsored by fossil fuel corporations, while delegates from countries on the front line of the climate emergency, such as Malawi, have really struggled to attend. Will the Cabinet Secretary commit to finding a way to directly support delegates from the Global South coming to Glasgow, while also committing to not sharing platforms with corporations and lobbyists who only want to slow action down on climate change?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I mean, we will continue to talk to the UK Government about the necessity, perhaps, of providing some assistance to ensure that people can actually come to COP26 if that is what is required. Of course, I will continue that conversation. In respect of oil and gas and other fossil fuel companies, you know, we recognise that that sector does have an important role to play in supporting the transition to a net zero emissions economy. So it is important that we continue to ensure that they are part of the conversation and not locked out on the other side of the conversation. We need them to help design the diverse energy system that we do need for the future, and that includes options such as hydrogen production and developing floating wind and marine energy. So it is important that we continue to engage with that sector and make sure that they are part of the transition that we require to make over the next 10 years as well as until 2045.
I have to ask people to speed up things a bit. Bill Kidd, followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much. Scotland has a strong and specialised third sector working in climate change, climate resilience and international development. What strategies does the Scottish Government have in place to encourage the engagement of climate and international development NGOs in the creation of COP26 events?
Cabinet Secretary.
As indicated, we do recognise the important contribution these NGOs do play in tackling the global climate emergency and meeting sustainable development goals. In recognition of this, we have been meeting regularly with our stakeholders and NGOs, international NGOs, to coordinate activities for a successful and impactful COP26. And we do look forward to continuing to do that work, both up to the COP26 in November and in the legacy thereafter.
Liam MacArthur, followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you. Following on from Claudia Beanish's question, could the Cabinet Secretary advise when she'll be able to update the Chamber on the implementation of the recommendations from the Just Transitions interim report? And will she ask her officials also to engage directly with the Speaker of the National Assembly of Malawi, who indicated to myself and Mark Ruskell last week her determination to see the National Assembly fully engaged with COP26 later this year?
Cabinet Secretary.
I can certainly wholeheartedly agree with the second part of that. My answer to the first part is soon.
Bob Doris, followed by Finlay Carson.
Presiding Officer, I am disappointed at the petulant attitude of the UK Government regarding the use of the Glasgow Science Centre. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to look at the bigger picture and provide more information as to how the Scottish Government intends to showcase Scotland's work on climate change, whether at the Science Centre or elsewhere?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, our intention is to host a programme of events for people and community groups around the summit to ensure Scotland as a whole can show its support for climate action, and also to be able to showcase those aspects of mitigation and adaptation that Scotland is very ambitious on. At the time we entered into our agreement, the Glasgow Science Centre had received no other requests for exclusive hire of the venue during COP. So the Science Centre was entirely and wholly available. Our recent understanding of the completely changed view of the UK government, has obviously changed the conversation around that, and I reiterate that COP26 must transcend politics, and I hope the offer that we have made to the UK government will conclude the matter without delay.
Finlay Carson, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Agriculture has already shown its willingness to step up to the mark to do their bit. And in their document, Ability for the Platform for Change suggests that an additional £100 million is required for transition. The Committee on Climate Change suggested that industrial clusters could be developed around sources of renewable energy, many of which is in rural areas. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline how she intends to rural-proof policy to ensure rural areas share in the benefits and not just the burdens of climate change policy?
I would have to ask Finlay Carson if he's met my colleague Fergus Ewing, who will be absolutely ensuring that the rural economy can benefit very much from the changes going forward. I wouldn't want to step into the agriculture conversation in case that I inadvertently say something my colleague isn't happy with. I'm sure I wouldn't, but I want to be on the careful side. But I would respectfully point out, as he probably knows is coming, the enormous game-changing commitment to money in the peatland restoration, he was ahead of me there, will have a massive benefit for the rural economy, as well as for emissions reductions and biodiversity.
Sarah Boyack, followed by Annabel Ewing.
What opportunities will there be for showcasing some of the inspiring best practice from our local councils, public sector organisations such as our NHS, and from our communities at COP26? And what access will such groups have to the summit itself?
Cabinet Secretary.
The first part of that is that we are having serious conversations about COP26 and what might and might not be appropriate to go on there right across the board, as one would imagine with the public sector more widely. I know a number of local councils are very keen to be able to showcase their work, and I met very recently with Orkney Islands Council in respect of that. So that is an ongoing conversation. I suppose for the second part of the question, there is a conversation to be had with the UK government, the extent to which they allow the doors to open to other actors in this and ensure that they are able to showcase what they want to showcase.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Mollis Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how the Scottish Government will seek to ensure that the holding of COP26 can both maximise sustainable economic opportunities for Glasgow and for Scotland, and at the same time minimise disruption to the working life of the city and its residents?
Cabinet Secretary.
As the member will expect me to say, there's a considerable amount of work being done into the logistics that will require to be put in place to manage COP26 in the centre of a very busy city in November in Scotland. There are some challenges, there's no doubt about that, but a lot of work is going in to make sure that happens. In respect of being used to attract sustainable economic opportunities for Scotland, this is the largest event of this nature ever to be held in the UK, so we do welcome the opportunity to showcase its exceptional landscape, venues, hospitality, culture, and ensure that visitors experience the very best of Scottish welcome. So we will use it as a catalyst, as I indicated in my statement, to attract new investment, innovation and sustainable economic growth for Scotland. And I hope that that is the message that will go out globally from Scotland as a result of COP26.
Maurice Golden, followed by Rona Mackay.
We all want Scotland to be a world leader in tackling climate change and meet its targets. Will the SNP meet their target of recycling 60% of household waste by the time COP26 comes around?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'll get back to Maurice Golden on that, but can I gently and with the best possible intentions suggest that perhaps Maurice might want to think a little bit more strategically about COP26 and find a way to rise above an attempt to just make petty party political points.
Rona Mackay, followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline how young people will be encouraged to be involved in COP26?
Cabinet Secretary,
well,
did you hear that?
We are speaking to a very wide range of people, and that includes young people. We do want it to be an inclusive COP. where all voices can be heard. Obviously, young people have been pretty instrumental over the last few years in bringing this to public consciousness. So we're working with partners to develop a programme of activities and events for community and civic engagement to take place before, during and after COP. And I would remind people as well that there is a parallel youth COP which is being run in Italy. I'm not 100% certain how that is going to be managed at the moment, but there is a very active youth COP strand to the work that is being done. But I hope that what we do deliver will help to deliver a legacy of climate change awareness in Scotland. There are very detailed, very serious, very consistent conversations about activity around the COP taking place on a very regular basis within the Scottish Government and with our stakeholders.
Colin Smith.
Agree that COP26 needs to involve all of Scotland and should therefore ensure that proposals from communities out with the Central Belt, such as Dumfries and Galloway, a region aiming to be carbon neutral by 2025, are back to host delegate visits or affiliate events, so we can not only showcase the carbon reduction assets of that region, but actually make sure that people from across Scotland are involved in a conference, even if they don't travel to Glasgow.
That's actually a very important question, and we have been asking, and particularly in areas such as Orkney, Dumfries and Galloway, etc., that there's two sides to that. There's their ability to actually present the good news of what they do to the COP itself, but there's a possibility, and we're trying to explore that, of encouraging some of the visitors to the COP to actually go out to some of these areas and see for themselves some of the very good work that is being done. I know Orkney Council is very keen on that idea, and I would be very happy to speak to any local authority who has particular ideas about how that might be managed. It isn't necessarily in our gift, and these are some of the issues that need to be explored as we move towards November, but it is certainly something that I initially raised as a possibility to put a more Scottish stamp on the COP that would actually encourage people to think about what was available for them to see when they came to Glasgow, and not always just to stay in Glasgow.
Thank you. That concludes questions on COP26. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and members who have managed to get all the questions asked and answered. There will be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business.
The next item of business is debate on motion 21170 in the name of Ben Macpherson on the Local Government Finance Scotland Order 2020. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Ben Macpherson to speak to and move the motion for up to 7 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The purpose of today's debate on the Local Government Finance Order is to seek Parliament's approval to the guaranteed allocations of revenue funding to individual local authorities for 2020-21. It also seeks agreement to the allocation of additional funding for 2019-20, which has been identified since the 2019 order was approved this time last year. The delay to the UK budget means that we still do not know the total budget available to Scotland next year. Therefore, we have had to make assumptions around Barnett consequentials, use provisional economic forecasts and take forward decisions on devolved tax policy without knowledge of future UK tax policy. That position is not of our choosing and creates unnecessary challenges. Presiding Officer, under challenging circumstances, the 2020-21 budget delivers a fair settlement for local government. The funding package in 2020-21 provides local government with a real terms increase in both revenue and overall funding to invest in our public services. In 2020-21, the Scottish Government will provide councils with a total funding package worth £11.4 billion. This includes revenue funding of £10.7 billion and support for capital expenditure of £778 million. Today's order seeks Parliament's approval for the distribution and payment of £9.9 billion out of the revenue total of £10.7 billion. This £9.9 billion is a combination of general revenue grant of £7.1 billion and the distributable amount of non-domestic rates income, which has been set at £2.8 billion. The Scottish Government continues to guarantee each local authority the combined general revenue grant plus non-domestic rate income. This means that any loss of non-domestic rate income resulting from the adverse impact of Brexit or COVID-19 will also be compensated for by increased general revenue grant. For clarity, the remainder of the funding package will be paid out as specific grant funding or other funding, which will be distributed later in year once agreed with COSLA. The overall funding package for... Yes, we have to take an intervention.
Andy Whiteman.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for taking an intervention. Can he clarify that the additional £95 million of revenue funding secured in the budget deal with the Scottish Green Party that does not appear to be in this order, given that the individual figures for each local authority are the same as Annex L of the settlement letter sent on 6th of February, can he clarify where that £95 million is being allocated and when?
Ben Macpherson.
I was... A very timious intervention, Mr Whiteman, thank you. And because I was about to say the overall funding package for 2020-21 includes an additional £95 million revenue funding to further support spending on day-to-day services, as announced on the 27th of February as part of the Stage 1 of the Budget Bill. £100 million for investment in health and social care and mental health services delegated to integration authorities, provision of £156 million for the Teachers' Pay Award and £97 million for teachers' pensions. £201 million of revenue and £121 million of capital to support the expansion of early years education and childcare to 1,140 hours by August 2020. Also, £88 million to maintain the pupil-teacher ratio and secure places for all probationers who require one, and the flexibility for local authorities to increase council tax levels by up to 3% in real terms, worth an estimated £135 million. Keen to make some progress, thanks. The 2020-21 settlement from the Scottish Government now provides local government with an increase in spending for local revenue services of £589 million or 5.8%. Taken together with the potential to raise council tax income, councils had access of up to a total increase of £724 million or 7.2% in spending power to support local authority services. All local authorities have now set their income tax levels for next year, and it should be noted that had all councils taken up the opportunity to increase council tax revenue by 3% in real terms, a further £8.3 million would have been available for local services. Clearly, those councils who have not taken up their full council tax flexibility consider they have a fair settlement. Presiding Officer, there remains a further £51.9 million of revenue funding that will be distributed once the necessary information becomes available and will be included for approval in the 2021 order. The amounts involved, as agreed with local government, are as follows. £37.6 million in respect of the 2020-21 Teachers Induction Scheme, £11.9 million in respect of the balance of the discretionary housing payments, £0.5 million in respect of mental health school counselling services, £0.4 million in respect of implementing the Barclay Review of non-domestic rates, and £1.4 million in terms of the Customer First top-up. In addition to the revenue funding contained within today's order, there is specific revenue funding that is paid directly by the relevant policy areas under separate legislation amounting to £709.7 million, including £120 million of pupil equity funding, £86.5 million for criminal justice social work funding, £487.3 million of funding for early years expansion, £11.5 million of additional support for Northern Ferries, and £4.4 million of Gaelic funding. Lastly, Presiding Officer, the 2019 order also seeks approval for changes to funding allocations for 2019-20 of £327.3 million, which have been added to fund a number of agreed spending commitments. The full list of changes can be found in the report to the 2020 order. These include £141 million for teachers' pay, £60.1 million for teachers' pensions, £37.5 million to support the 2019-20 Teachers Induction Scheme, £29.5 million for free personal care for the under-65s, £15 million for additional support for learning, £12 million to provide counselling services in schools, and £2.1 million to allow free access to sanitary products in our schools. In summary, Presiding Officer, the total funding from the Scottish Government to local government next year amounts to £11.4 billion. These funding proposals continue to deliver a fair financial settlement for our partners in local government, which will be strengthened by continued joint working to improve outcomes through first-class public services. Presiding Officer, I move that Parliament approves the Local Government Finance Scotland Order for 2020. Thank you.
Now call on Graeme Simpson for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful. If I could just start, I was going to intervene on the Minister because I didn't think he fully answered Mr Whiteman's question. Perhaps he may wish to return to it, because the question was, where does that extra £95 million appear in the order? So if it doesn't appear, it doesn't appear. I think the Minister may want to reflect on his response. Now, this is a technical debate, really. This is about giving the money that local government needs to local government, and it would be remiss of us not to support the motion on that basis, because clearly local government needs to be funded. That doesn't mean that we have to like the settlement, but settlement it is, and we need to pass that money to councils so that they can provide the services. And indeed, we don't like the settlement. We have spoken in the past 2 weeks in various budget debates about what we think about it. We think that this year's settlement, like last year's, and the year before that, and the year before that, and so on, is not proper or fair funding. And I recall last year at the Local Government Committee, when I had a bit of a debate with the predecessor to Kate Forbes and Miss Forbes herself about what is the definition of fair. And my view was that if all councils in Scotland are having to make cuts, that is hardly fair. And that's the position. Yes?
John Mason.
I thank the member very much for giving way. I agree with him that defining fair is not always easy. Does he think, therefore, that the NHS has had too much money and he would cut that to give more to local government?
Graeme Simpson.
I always regret letting Mr Mason in, because he makes the most obscure points in a debate about local government funding. Is he saying that this settlement is fair? I don't think it is, because we still end up in the position that every one of Scotland's 32 councils are having. Oh, and here comes Mr Macmillan. Well, we may as well let him in as well.
Stuart Macmillan.
I thank Mr Simpson for taking intervention. Is Mr Simpson seriously saying to the Chamber and this Parliament that even prior to this Parliament, when the Conservatives were in power in London, that no cuts ever took place to local authority budgets in Scotland?
Graeme Simpson.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm dealing with the budget in front of us today. the settlement in front of us today, which delivers cuts to every single one of Scotland's 32 councils. And that's not fair. And that has left councils on the brink, as a series of leading councillors have said in the past few weeks. COSLA's president, Alison Everson, Stephen Heddle, my good friend, Councillor Gail McGregor, who leads on finance for COSLA, all across the political spectrum. And you may even have the odd SNP council leader who privately don't like what's going on. So Scotland's council leaders were disappointed. And now here Mr Lyle chuntering away, as he often does. But if he's got anything worthwhile to say, let's hear it, and I'll let him in, rather than his usual "oh" from the sedentary position. If Mr Lyle has something positive to say, he can say it. It appears he doesn't. Now, council leader after council leader have said this fails to make any restoration of the significant cuts to local government core funding in previous years. They said it represents a 2% or £2.5 million cut in real terms in revenue funding for local government. And they said an extra 2% funding for inflationary pressures and 3% for restoration of previous funding cuts, or for restoration of the £117 million cut to capital allocation is needed. That's what's needed, and that's what this settlement does not do. Now, I've taken a couple of interventions so far. I was hoping Mr Lyle would intervene, but he hasn't. So we have a situation where revenue cuts are going down. It's going to take £300 million just to stand still, and that's not being delivered. Now, proper funding of councils matters. It matters when you want to tackle child poverty, for example. And here he is, Mr Lyle. We've got him.
A quick one, please. Yeah. Richard Lyle.
Would the member agree with me that the Tories, and thank you for taking the intervention, Mr Simpson, would the member agree with me that the Tory party has cut severely councils in England, more than what Scotland councils have had to suffer?
Graeme Simpson.
My word, we have the old English excuse. This is the Scottish Parliament, and in the Scottish Parliament we are cutting councils, we're cutting money to Scottish councils. I would have thought Mr Lyle, who represents North Lanarkshire, would have been concerned about that. He should be jumping up and down about what's happening in North Lanarkshire, not what's happening in England. He seems to be more concerned about what's going on over the border than on his own doorstep. What a position that is. Mr Lyle needs to explain to his constituents why he's taking that view. What an absurd position. Now, COSLA's Children and Young People spokesman...
Could we calm down a wee moment? And Mr Simpson, could you come to a close fairly soon?
I certainly will. I'd be delighted to come to a close. This settlement does not add up for local government. It leads to cuts across the board. But they need the money, so we'll support it begrudgingly.
Thank you. Now call Sarah Boyack for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Having given councils a third of the money they need to deliver Scottish Government promises and carry out their obligations and provide the services their communities need, this local government settlement is nothing to celebrate. I want to make 3 points. The reality of the disproportionate cuts to local government by the SNP, the increased control over the money that local government is allocated, and the impact on our communities and our constituents. Spice have noted that since 2013 to 14, the Scottish budget allocation from the UK Government has increased by 2.6%, yet the Scottish Government has reduced allocations to local government by 3.8%. And as I observed in our main budget debate, this settlement falls against a backdrop of almost £900 million of cuts to non-ring-fenced revenue funding since 2013-14, the loss of 10,000 full-time equivalent jobs, which translates into 33,000 redundancies, a slashed capital budget, leaving councils to borrow for funding vital projects, taking that money out of their revenue spend, and curtailed services hitting those who need them. Now, last week, SNP ministers made great play of their no tax increases for people on low and middle incomes. but they've passed on the difficult decisions to local councils. Grappling with gross underfunding, councils are having to use the levers they have available to them to balance the books, raising council tax and increasing charges for services. We have long argued, and the SNP, I understand, have recognised the regressive nature of council tax, which hits those least able to pay the most. Even the relief schemes, even after those relief schemes, data from Spice has shown that those on the lowest 10% of earners pay 17% of their income in council tax, compared to 1.5% of income for those in the top 10%. And if you add on to that increased charges for services councils provide, lower income households are being priced out of services they are already struggling to access. There's also the issue of comparing local government funding this year with last year, a reduction in capital, but an increase in ring-fenced capital allocations, a reduction in the general revenue grant, but an increase in specific resource grants. Now, the Minister told us today that COSLA has agreed with the decisions to ring-fence core expenditure, but I believe that this year the Scottish Government has gone too far. In the days before this Parliament, we used to have a Scottish administration. Its policy and funding set at a UK level. What an irony. We now have a Scottish Government which increasingly is turning local government into local administration. It leaves the Scottish Government... Yes, I'd be delighted to take an intervention.
James Dornan.
Will the member recognise that in terms of ring fencing, there's much less ring fencing going on now than there was under the previous government in this Parliament, and that was a Labour and Lib Dem government?
Sarah Boyack.
Sorry, I just would make the point that that was at a point where the money was being doubled through Gordon Brown's interventions. We're talking about a reverse in approach here. We've now got a Scottish Government which is turning our local government colleagues into administrators, leaving them all the tough decisions. It does give the Scottish Government little pots of money to allocate throughout the year, which is much better for photo ops. But it's our constituents who suffer, and we need to pay attention to the human story behind all of this. Take social care as just one critical example of council services facing cuts. I want to share the struggle of one of my constituents, trying to get a basic care package to enable them to go about their daily life. This constituent was assessed as having a care need in May last year. They came to me for help in November. I have just found out in this week that there is still not any appropriate care and support being offered, with no agency to provide the care and not even basic safety measures installed. A case riddled with lack of resources, high staff turnover, demonstrating the crisis in social care in our local authorities. And that is not just that one case. We know from statistics that is widespread. The cuts to local government are now so severe that even statutory services such as care and education are at a breaking point and under huge pressure. And that's the human cost of underfunding local government. Waiting 6 months for a care package is unacceptable, no matter how this government spins it. And the pressure of staff trying to ration, to trying to provide services when we know we have people having to take sick leave is just not acceptable. It's clear from this statement we have in front of us today, this order, that our local councils do not have the resources they need. In the long term, lack of investment in our communities ultimately costs all of us. It increases poverty. It undermines our communities. It's time for change. What we need is bold, transformative policies to deliver real results, create jobs, end poverty and tackle climate change. Sadly, this is not what this order is about today.
Andy Whiteman, 4 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. As members have already indicated, this is an important debate today, allocating over £9.8 billion to local government, and an hour barely does it justice. But nevertheless, as members know from my previous contributions, Greens believe it's fundamentally better for us all if decisions about local authorities' finances are taken by the people who care most about that local authority, that is, by the people living in that local authority. And alert members will recognise that turn of phrase from the Yes campaign in the 2014 independence referendum, and what's argued by some to be a right for Scotland should also be a right, we believe, for local authorities. And thus it's a matter of regret that so much of the capital and revenue allocations for councils continues to be determined by this Parliament. However, while that is the case, Greens will and have done all they can to ensure that the funding settlement is adequate and have secured hundreds of millions of pounds in extra revenue over the past few years. But I freely admit that this is not the settlement that we in government we'd seek to secure. For one thing, despite the historic decline in ring fencing, as just been debated, the financial settlement continues to be bedevilled by ring fencing, and indeed by terms such as protected funds that are still not actually very clear and compromise the scrutiny that we in the Local Government Committee have been able to make of this budget. And that's true to the extent that this year's additional commitments were not even fully funded, despite a government commitment to that effect, which is why filling the 95 million hole was an important achievement in this year's budget. And I'll be grateful if the Minister could provide extra clarity in his closing remarks as to when that 95 million will be delivered, why it's not in the order. This order was laid on the 19th of February, as I understand it. We had a stage 1 debate on the budget on the 27th of February, at which we reached agreement on that quantum of 95 million. Now, despite differences of opinion, and they exist, on the sums of money outlined in this order, we should all vote for it tonight, because it does provide the legal basis on which the Scottish Government can transfer sums of money, substantial sums of money, to councils who rely on it to deliver vital public services. Now, the decisions on how this money is spent, of course, are made by councils. And one of the interesting things in recent years, following on from a Green initiative in Edinburgh Council, is that citizens now have the opportunity not only to scrutinise council budgets, but also to be actually actively involved in the process through participatory budgeting. By 2021, by law, at least 1% of council budgets will be subject to participatory budgeting, directly involving the public in how money is spent. We don't believe that 1% is enough, but it's worth noting that it's more than the percentage of the Scottish budget that is allocated by any participatory budgeting. The sum at the moment is zero, and that's something I think the Scottish Government should consider doing in future. Presiding Officer, it's long past time, in our view, to increase the fiscal autonomy of local government, and that's why we're pleased to have secured longer-term reforms, including, importantly, a commitment to a fiscal framework, a rules-based framework that provides clarity and predictability to the funding settlement, and hopefully will in future years take some, though not all, the political dynamics out of it. And so I was interested earlier this week to receive a letter from Gail McGregor, COSLA's spokesperson for resources, which I hope other parties have received, I'm sure they have, outlining COSLA's thinking about how this fiscal framework might operate. I was interested in particular to note a reference to Article 9 of the European Charter of Local Self-Government, as I'll shortly be introducing a Members' Bill to incorporate this into Scots law. Presiding Officer, if local government doesn't have the autonomy it needs, it can serve its citizens no better than if this Parliament does not have sufficient powers. And lack of agency, in turn, erodes trust between citizens and the local state. Presiding Officer, I don't feel comfortable sitting in this Parliament and voting on how much money local government should receive, but we are where we are, and we'll be supporting the order at decision time. Thank you.
Willie Rennie, 4 minutes, please.
I'm grateful to SPICE and the Financial Scrutiny Unit for giving us the detailed breakdown of the allocations to local authorities. I'm sure you'll remember, Deputy Presiding Officer, that for some time we've been debating these matters, in particular the shortfall that Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire and Edinburgh got from the local government financial settlement. They didn't get anywhere near the grants of other local authorities. The SNP government pretended to listen. It enacted the 85% rule to make sure every local authority got at least 85% of the average. Yet that didn't work either, as councils like Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire and Edinburgh often still didn't meet the rule. Each council, not just now, each council was deprived of millions of pounds every year. It was not untypical for Aberdeen to lose out on £20 million in one financial year. Yet SNP MSPs from Aberdeen, like Kevin Stewart and Maureen Watt, still voted for it. To get round this embarrassment, ministers changed the rule. They did not increase the funding, but the rule based on the average of all councils in the country was changed to include all councils except Orkney, Shetland, Western Isles, Argyll and Bute, West Dunbartonshire and Inverclyde Council. So all the councils except not all the councils. But that still didn't quite work either. Taking out a fifth of the councils was not enough, so the government changed the formula again. The government lumped in council tax revenue on top of the government grant. And finally, the jiggery-pokery worked. All the councils met the rule, but without receiving one single penny more in funding. Edinburgh only just meets the 85% rule, even though they are still millions of pounds short. So this is the big question this afternoon. Will Ben Macpherson stand up for his city in the way that Maureen Watt and Kevin Stewart did not? Will the Minister stand up for Edinburgh, or will his city get the same treatment as Aberdeen City? Not just now. Can he explain why he is shortchanging Edinburgh by this government's formula? It's worth £116 per person. That would amount to £60 million across the whole city. When you look at how the SNP Council in Edinburgh is cutting teachers and nursery schools and threatening support for community policing, you wonder why the government isn't taking this much more seriously. The Council estimates that we'll have to make savings totalling £100 million by 2022-23. In Aberdeen City, they are used to this. They have been kept at the bottom of the table for a decade without their SNP MSPs lifting a finger to help. This year, it's the same again. They are £57 per person below a true 85% floor. That means the Council is almost £13 million short. But back to Ben Macpherson. What is he going to do this afternoon? Will he stand up for his government and its rigged formula, or will he stand up for his city? Thank you.
We now move to the open debate and speeches of 4 minutes, please. James Dornan, followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be given the opportunity to speak in today's debate, which thankfully comes at the end of our budgetary process. I'd like to put on record my sincere admiration for how Kate Forbes, our new Cabinet Secretary for Finance, along with her team, steered the government through the difficult budget negotiations. Sorry, I woke Richard up there. Securing an agreement which boasts support for young people, police, climate action and local government. Despite being set against the background of heightened uncertainty and risk created by the Tory government following their decision to delay the UK budget until only this week, the Scottish Government's budget provides local government with a substantial funding package worth £11.4 billion in total. And of course I know from my own local authority, Glasgow City Council, that local government does face its financial challenges, but so does central government, from continued Tory austerity and cuts to our budget. Chancellors, including the last one, Sajid Javid, who, by the way, never even managed to produce a single budget, promised an end to austerity in 2018 and again in 2019 and failed to deliver. I don't hold out any hope for an end to austerity tomorrow either, and to be honest, do any of you? Scotland's discretionary resource budget allocation in 2021 will be 2.8 or £840 million lower in real terms than it was in 2010-11, which obviously has a knock-on effect on central and local government finances. Our council budgets, nonetheless, are under considerably less pressure in Scotland than in England. But the Tories are in government, despite they want to hide it, because of the relative protection that we've been able to provide. This year's local government finance settlement, which delivers the highest annual revenue budget increase since this administration came into power, will boost day-to-day spending for local services by £590 million in cash terms, a real terms increase of 3.9%. The settlement will allow councils, like Glasgow City Council, to deliver on the expansion of free early learning and childcare provision, to protect the most vulnerable in our communities, ensure improved outcomes with the integration of health and social care services, and maintain the pupil-teacher ratio. And on that last point regarding teachers' numbers, Labour's budget in Glasgow would have cut 200 teachers from our schools at a time when we are making huge progress in overcoming our poverty-related attainment challenges. As I've admitted, there are, of course, pressures in our finances, but whether it's central government or local government, Scottish Labour's priorities continue to be all wrong. Presiding Officer, despite our challenging financial situation, in addition to protecting our local councils, we remain in a position to protect our council taxpayers too. In 2019-20, the average charge for all property bands, including E, F, G and H, is between £330 and £499 lower in Scotland and England. The average band D council tax bill in Scotland this financial year is £1,251 compared to £1,750 in Tory-run England and £1,591 in Labour-run Wales. And furthermore, we're also able to maintain the UK's most competitive business rates regime. Would the member give way? Certainly I'll give way.
Quickly, please, Bob
I
Doris.
thank Mr Dornan for giving way. It's reasonable to ask for more money for local government, Mr Dornan, but in doing so you have to see where that money would come from. Did any of the parties on your committee suggest how much more councils should get and where that money would come from?
To be honest, it was a question...
Excuse me. First of all,
My
you speak
apologies.
through the chairs
My
instead of
apologies,
having conversations with each other, even though you're so close at the moment. James Dornan.
Bob and I are always close, Presiding Officer. The reality is that question was asked of almost every witness that we had in front of us, and none of them could give a positive answer about how they'd be able to raise the money to make up for the extra costs that we're asking, and none of our members could come with a fully costed plan either. So, furthermore, we're also able to maintain the UK's most competitive business rates regime. This includes the lowest poundage and relief package, including the small business bonus and business growth accelerator, estimated by the Scottish Fiscal Commission to be worth £744 million. Scotland's poundage will be 49.8 pence, delivering a below-inflation increase for the second consecutive year. Limiting the increase to 1.6 will ensure that 95% of properties in Scotland pay a lower poundage than in other parts of the UK. And, Presiding Officer, before closing, I'd just like to add that our local councils will be key players in how, as a country, we can tackle the coronavirus outbreak. I therefore hope that in tomorrow's UK budget we see additional resources to help us deal with such pressures and to end austerity. I'm sure we'll all be waiting with bated breath. As I've outlined, it's absolutely clear that despite ongoing pressures from Tory austerity, the Scottish Government continues to treat local government very fairly, enabling to provide high-quality frontline services that improve outcomes for people and communities right across Scotland. I'll be delighted to vote in favour for this finance order this evening.
Right. We're over time already in this debate. Unless others are very tight in their timing, I'm going to have to take it off the closing speeches. And I call Jeremy Balfour, followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Deputy President Officer. I, along with my colleagues on this side of the chamber, will vote for this this evening later on. But I vote with it with a deeply heavy heart and with a lack of ambition by the Scottish Government. Because what we have seen not only in this financial settlement, but in previous financial settlements, is the clear lack of prioritisation by the SNP in regard to council funding. We have seen cuts, we have seen services affected, we have seen council taxes rise. And we, in a moment, we sit here and we quote figures at each other, figures which, to be honest, go beyond the average person. But let me give the Minister a real example of an individual within his constituency here in Edinburgh. This is what she wrote to me just earlier in this week. I am a parent of a child attending a primary school nursery here in Edinburgh. Our excellent nursery teacher does an incredible, valuable job of laying the foundations for school years and has my full support. I was shocked to hear that she will lose her post this summer, and I believe the removal of the teacher post will disrupt early years learning in the school and the development of our children next year. I wonder if the Minister, in his summing up, would apologise to this lady and the many others within this city that are losing teachers because of the settlement that he is bringing forward here. No, I won't. He said in his opening remarks that he thought this was a fair settlement. How is it fair for that child to lose their teacher? Now, he will stand up and say it's his SNP cronies up at the council who are making these decisions. But they're making these decisions because it's his government that is lacking the ambition for our children and our older people in city by cutting the funding to councils, not only here in Edinburgh, but across Scotland. And what the Minister should do in his summing up is apologise to the people of Edinburgh for this shocking cut. Absolutely.
Bob Doris.
I'll make the same comment to the member, Presiding Officer, that I made to Mr Dornan. It's reasonable to ask for more money for councils, but you have to put a sum on that and you have to say where it's coming from. So could the member put a sum on that and say today where it's coming from?
James Balfour. Oh,
well,
sorry,
yet again, the SNP just don't simply understand what we're debating. We're not debating the budget today. That happened last week. We voted against your budget. You got the Boris bonus and you have simply misused it. You have not given the money to local government. And the people of Scotland are waking up to this. I feel all the shouting from the seats sums up a deep, uncomfortable feeling amongst the SNP benches about this.
There is no time for further interventions.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I conclude as I started. Yes, we will vote with this with a heavy heart. But the message that comes as we vote for this tonight is this government, this SNP party, don't care about local communities, don't care about local funding, and they're cutting local government, and they should be ashamed of that. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Call Rhoda Grant to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate focuses entirely on the work of local government and highlights that they have borne the brunt of cuts. We all know these cuts fall disproportionately on the poor and on women. As Sarah Boyack said, non-ring-fenced revenue funding has been cut by £898.8 million in real terms between 2013 and this budget. This is the money that councils use to react to differing circumstances in their areas, their discretionary spend. They fund things like economic development and provide services that meet the needs of their communities. Presiding Officer, this shows councils have no discretion at all. Details of the impacts of those new cuts are only coming to the fore. Councils such as Murray are having to increase burial charges and charge for music tuition in schools. I fear soon that music tuition will only be available to those who can afford it, and that's to all their detriment. Murray are also cutting funding to Women's Aid. Falkirk Council is having to remove Christmas lights, close public toilets and withdraw the taxi card budget. The taxi card helps people with disabilities who cannot use ordinary buses to travel in taxis at a reduced fare. These cuts show that the most vulnerable in our communities are losing out. One of the increasing issues in my post bag is the availability of assistance for children with additional support needs. And this is being cut. And at the same time, young people who require support are also losing out at school. These young people already face challenge, and that's being made worse by these cuts. Parents are unable to work because they're constantly on call for their child's school. And I've got cases where police are being called regularly to deal with distressed children. Other young people who are deemed less of a priority, despite being assessed as needing assistance, are receiving little or no support at school. Again, the most vulnerable being affected. Because of the underfunding of local government, community care also suffers, and this is despite the setting up of integrated joint boards, which appear to have not improved at all problems such as delayed discharge. They need investment, which is something our councils, in the face of cuts, cannot do. Some of the saddest cases are due to a lack of care at home. People being forced to live and die in hospital against their wishes and against their needs. These cuts drain the very compassion out of our societies. Councils are increasing council tax to the maximum that the SNP will allow, and it was clear from the Minister's opening statement this is an expectation, not a suggestion. People are frustrated by seeing services being cut by councils and their council tax increasing. This SNP government came into power promising to abolish the regressive council tax, yet over a decade later they're still there and increasing faster than inflation. The Greens in last year's budget deal were promised talks about its abolition. These are ongoing but making no progress. Despite pleas for change, the only information the Scottish Government present to the cross-party talks are the impact of tinkering with bans and revaluation. This is not the work of a government committed to the abolition of the council tax. Presiding Officer, when our communities complain about rising council tax bills and falling services, it's not to their local councillors they should complain. Their complaints should be voiced to this SNP government. It is them who have imposed those cuts, and it is them who have imposed council tax rises. Councillors are merely doing the dirty work of this SNP government, a government that refuses to invest and is too timid to make real change.
The last of the open debate contributions is from John Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Once again, we deal with another aspect of the budget, although I think in practice most of the decisions were made last week. The key points are that COSLA made it clear they needed an extra £95 million, and that has been found with the help of the Greens. In Glasgow, that seems to have been enough to save the Blair Vadich Outdoor Centre, which is obviously very welcome. But I'm sure we would all agree that local government could do with more money, and they are certainly asking for more money. The problem is that we have a fairly fixed amount of money available, and in fact, even that will not be entirely clear until after tomorrow's budget at Westminster. We might have been able to raise a little more income tax, but that would probably only have been marginal, and we made that decision last week. And as we said then, we cannot have too much divergence from the UK on income tax, and our powers over income tax are limited, while we have no control at all over VAT, corporation tax, inheritance tax, or national insurance. It makes it much more difficult to create a joined-up tax system when we have control over the few but not the many. This means that more money for local government would inevitably mean a cut to the NHS budget. I accept that the NHS has its budget better protected than most sectors have in recent years. However, we have to acknowledge that the health sector faces rising demand, greater expectations from the public, and particular uncertainty at this time. No sector has as much money as it could do with. So that means everyone has to do the best they can with the budget they have. It is maybe worth mentioning here that MSPs need to be careful about increasing their own budgets, for example for staffing, beyond inflation when others are not able to do so. As well as the size of the local government cake, there is the question as to how it is divided up between councils. Glasgow City Council feels it gets a raw deal as its needs are much more severe than other councils, and they feel this is not properly taken into account. But at the same time, other councils may and do argue that they get less per head, even if their needs are not so great. That formula and the related floor could perhaps be improved, but that would require agreement from COSLA and the local authorities, which is never likely to be easy. Yes?
Andy Whiteman.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. Does he agree with me that this formula, and it was referred to by the Liberal Democrats, by Mr Rennie, is agreed by the Scottish Government and COSLA, and the fact that there's no parliamentary scrutiny of it makes it very difficult to challenge some of these elements?
John Mason.
Well, I don't know the details, but I would have thought the Local Government Committee could have looked at the formula and investigated it, but I'm not sure if they've tried that or not been able to do that. But I think, everyone has said they're open to changing that formula, but the reality is, if Aberdeen is going to argue that they need more money because of the more people they've got, and Glasgow argues because of the need, it is difficult to reach an agreement. Anyway, there will also I do agree, which I think would be Mr Whiteman's point, that we need a radical overhaul of local government financing. And that will involve deciding how local government should be funded in the longer term. Most of us would agree that council tax is far from ideal, but there seems to be no agreement as to what is better. Should it be local income tax, land valuation tax? They all have their drawbacks. Again, councils are being limited as to how much they can raise council tax, and some would think this is too restrictive. However, many of us remember the times when Labour in Glasgow raised council tax dramatically year after year, and we do not want to go back to times like that. However, there has been progress, and councils are going to have powers over tourist tax and workplace parking levy. I, for one, would certainly like to see local authorities being much more financially independent of central government than they are, and that could be built into a future Scottish constitution. However, that is more a hope for the medium to long term. Once again, we are having to choose priorities, and all of us would like to give more to everyone. However, I would suggest that this is a reasonable settlement for local government, given the tight restraints. Thank you.
We now move to the closing speeches, and we're really tight for time, so Sarah Boyack, no more than 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think today is a very short debate. And actually, we've discussed some of the key issues in previous weeks when we discussed the main budget debate. But I just want to highlight some of the briefings we've had in advance of today, because there hasn't been so much reference to them. I was grateful for the unison briefing, for example, that was sent across, and I do hope that all members read it, because what they have been doing over the last few years is actually interviewing their members, looking at the pressures in local government, and picking up the point that cuts to local government impact on staff's capacity to deliver, because in addition to the pressures experienced by our communities, we have the pressure experienced by hard-working council staff who are trying to fill the service gaps to help constituents who are increasingly stressed and suffering from increased inequalities and ill health. And their most recent frontline briefing on social work vividly illustrated the impact on staff and the challenges that they have to deal with, and the impact on their health and the impact on absences. And that's something that has not come to the prominence in this debate, but is a key issue for our local authorities moving ahead. I do also want to acknowledge the work of my Labour colleagues in different council areas who are doing their best with the underfunding, which is not just a direct result of this year's budget, but since 2013. They have worked hard to say no to privatisation, no to compulsory redundancies, and make sure council staff are paid the living wage. And the other briefings that we've received over the last few weeks are from COSLA. Their arguments have been incredibly powerful, and they've not been addressed this afternoon, because right across local government services, they've highlighted the profound impact of underfunding, impact on education, on transport, on social care, and investing to deliver the climate transformation we need. In all of those areas, our local authorities are not just deliverers of services, but they're also key leaders in their area. They have the capacity to make the changes, but the underfunding is forcing them to go back to core services and not to do the range of services that are absolutely critical. The comments that my colleague Rhoda Grant made about women's aid, music tuition, there's a whole raft of councils now are beginning to charge for music tuition. Some already do that. Things like taxi card budgets. These are savings that will actually hit us in the long term, because it's meaning that young people are not getting the opportunities, the skills, the experiences that they should have. I want to turn briefly to the fiscal framework, I think mentioned by Andy Whiteman, who I thought in a very well-judged speech was actually quite honest that this is not the budget we need. It's the budget that's in front of us. We would have wanted it to be better, and that's why we don't think it's worth supporting today. The key principles in the fiscal framework should actually focus all of our minds. The parity of esteem, we haven't seen that. If we had parity of esteem, local authorities wouldn't be getting the 95 million, they'd be getting the other money to deliver the core services, to look at the real terms costs, to look at the presumption that recognising the importance of subsidiarity, the principle that devolution should go further than the Scottish Parliament and that should be the norm. And that we should prioritise the principle of essential services at the core for the benefit of our communities. Would that this order delivered on these principles, because it is clear that it does not. And the thing that I would say to SNP colleagues in the chamber is that you need to do a harder job pushing your government, not just in public, but behind the scenes as well. I have to say, I don't have time in my closing remarks, having been on both sides of this chamber, I have experienced the pressure that's come from colleagues to make a difference in this chamber, and it's absolutely critical. And the comment about local government committee, we were taking evidence from a whole range of stakeholders, and a lot of people don't like criticising the government because the government provides the funds. And there's a key issue for us as MSPs. We have a privilege. We get to speak straight to the government, whether we're in government or whether we are in opposition, and we can say what the reality is. I hope the Scottish Government will reflect on what we've said today and think about that for future budgets. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Alexander Burnett, no more than 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'd like to join my fellow colleagues Graeme Simpson and Jeremy Balfour in our intent to support the motion today. But as pointed out, it's a technical motion that allows councils to receive their funding. So whilst we support the motion so that the annual process can happen, but only on the basis that it is to show our support for local authorities to receive proper and fair funding. However, as it has been said, this settlement for our local authorities is not fair, and we will continue to call for better funding for our struggling councils across Scotland.
Excuse me a minute, Mr Burnett. Mr Leo.
Just a second.
Please don't have your back to the chair.
Now, my colleague Graeme Simpson made a good point that this is not a well-being budget for local government. For a Scottish government who spoke about how their budget would ensure the well-being of his country, I'm not sure how they thought reducing local government's total capital budgets in real terms by 30%, or nearly 335 million, is going to benefit the well-being of anyone. Yeah.
Bob Doris.
Thank you very much for giving way. Presiding Officer, opposition members have consistently called for more money for local government. That's a valid thing to do. But no opposition member has put a number on that or said where the money will come from. Will you be the exception and say where that money will actually come from, or is it just false promises?
Alexander Burnett.
Thank you. I think we've always made our point that if you focus more on growing the economy and raising revenue, then there would be more money to spend. If Scotland had had the same economic growth as the rest of the UK, it would be £500 million more that you could be putting into all services, whether it's local government or the NHS. Now, my colleague Jeremy Balfour made another valuable point in that we have a duty to ensure that the next generation and vulnerable people are being cared for, and more money from increased income would help that no end as well. Now, the rest of the debate has been relatively consensual in that most people all agree that the severity of the cuts that this order actually makes. Sarah Boyack has highlighted particularly the issues on ring fencing and passing of the decision-making of these cuts from Scottish Government to councils. Andy Whiteman and the Greens are maybe now wondering, does that money actually exist and whether the 95 million actually exists on the order paper. And as the Minister's been asked now 3 times in this debate to answer that, I hope he'll be able to in his closing remarks. Willie Rennie made an extremely valuable contribution and importantly highlighted how councils in the North East, such as Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, are further shortchanged by this process under the funding formula. Yes, certainly.
Mike Rumbles.
I am genuinely puzzled why the Conservatives are supporting this order. It's not a good order. If you vote it down, all the government has to do is bring back a better order, and our constituents in the North East would benefit from that.
Alexander Burnett.
I appreciate his views on the process. However, our view is that if we don't support it, the councils will get nothing. But I do take on board the members' points. Now, James Dornan, as usual, well, he has plenty to say on Kate Forbes and even Sajid Javid, rather less on his colleague Derek Mackay, who actually wrote the budget. Now, Rhoda Grant touched on how these impacts are actually materialising from Murray, which will see increases in burial charges, and Falkirk, which will see cuts to women's aid. And John Mason also spoke, who feels that the 90 million satisfies COSLA's requirements, but unfortunately thinks that everything in this debate has been a choice between local government and the NHS. And as I pointed out earlier in response to an intervention, perhaps if more time was spent focusing on growing revenues through a growing economy, we might just have the answer. So in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, we will be supporting the motion, but let it be known we are not happy about doing so. And like councils across the country, we are being pushed into a corner to make this decision. Thank you.
I now call on Ben Macpherson to wind up this debate for up to 6 minutes. Please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'll try and reflect on a number of points raised. But I think it's important, first of all, to just reiterate that this Local Government Finance Order 2020 that I'm seeking parliamentary approval to is to guarantee payment of £9.9 billion in revenue support to be paid to Scotland's 32 local authorities to enable them to provide the people of Scotland with the full range of services they expect and deserve. To come to some of the points raised, first of all, the quite reasonable point raised particularly by Andy Whiteman about the 95 million. Just for clarity, the figures presented for approval today do include the 95 million. The previous order that was laid was withdrawn and relayed on the 4th of March, and in Schedule 1 the 95 million is included. So I hope that gives the clarity that was requested. There's 45 million in the revenue support grant in Schedule 1 of the order and 50 million in the non-domestic rate income in Schedule 1 of the order. Just to also, for clarity, a number of members raised the point around ring fencing. I think it's worth noting that local authorities have a complete autonomy to allocate over 91% or £10.4 billion of the funding provided by the Scottish Government, plus all locally raised income. Again, just quite pressed for time. Yes.
Andy Whiteman.
Very much thank the Minister. I mean, I hope he may write to me to clarify these points, because this order, the figures in it, are exactly the same as the settlement letter of the 6th of February. So I mean, I've no doubt that this 95 million exists, but maybe write to me after today. clarify.
Given undertaking that it is, but I will write as soon as possible after this to just clarify that in writing with the member. The other point that was raised by a number of members was around the fiscal framework. Just for information, officials from the Scottish Government at Oslo will meet this week to continue to discuss that point. I thought Willie Rennie's contribution, apart from being quite personal, it's worth pointing out that the points he raised should be seen in context, that the overall local government settlement is distributed in full using the needs-based formula agreed with COSLA, as John Mason rightly pointed out, that the Scottish Government is open to consider any specific changes to the formula. However, any proposals must come through COSLA. And I think that's the right forum for that to happen. No, thank you. No, thank you. I think it's also important, again,
Excuse me, Mr Macpherson. Mr Day, will you stop having private conversations with your back to the chair? And Mr Rumbles, would you stop encouraging them all? Thanks very much. Ben Macpherson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Jeremy Balfour, again, slightly personal, I thought, but of course raised a constituent inquiry, which is perfectly right and legitimate. I should just point out with regard to what he said that the settlement that the context of the settlement today includes ongoing funding of £88 million to maintain the pupil-teacher ratio. And in 2020-21, Edinburgh Council will have an additional £66.1 million, or 8.8%, compared with 2019-20. I would also just subtly point out that I don't need Jeremy Balfour to relay to me the fact that I need to take constituent concerns seriously. I mean, I've done 2 open advice surgeries in the last 4 days, which is more than the neighbouring member for Edinburgh Central has done in 4 years. Presiding Officer, today's order also distributes £9.9 billion, and this is not the whole story, as it does not cover the £709.7 million of specific revenue grants, which includes funding for early learning and childcare, criminal justice, pupil equity funding, and additional support for ferries. This represents real money for vital local services and should not be discounted when trying to make funding comparisons. This means that next year the Scottish Government will provide local authorities with a total funding package worth of £11.4 billion, delivering a real terms increase of 3.9% for vital day-to-day services for all councils. There is also further Scottish Government support of almost £580 million paid out with the local government finance settlement, and this includes the Attainment Scotland Funds, Schools for the Future programme and City Deals, and is paid to local authorities, bringing the Scottish Government's total to over £12 billion. Presiding Officer, for context, despite Scotland's discretionary resource budget allocation being £840 million lower than it was in 2010-11, the Scottish Government has continued to protect Scotland's local authorities. The 2021 settlement will provide an increase of £589.4 million in local government day-to-day spending for local revenue services. Taken together with the potential to raise the council tax by 3%, in real terms, councils had the potential to spend around an extra £724.4 million in 2020-21. As Andy Whiteman pointed out, opposition members should note that failure to approve the order today would result in Scotland's local authorities and, as a consequence, all of our local communities being deprived of £589 million additional Scottish Government investment. So I'm grateful to both the Greens and the Conservatives for being responsible and stating that they will vote in support of this today. I encourage Parliament to support the local government finance order before us to ensure our local authorities can continue to deliver vital local services and finalise the significant funding package that will be provided by the Scottish Government. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
That concludes the debate on Local Government Finance Scotland Order 2020 in draft, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business. Give a moment or so for members to get themselves rearranged.
Thank you. Our next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 21173 in the name of Graeme Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a timetable for Stage 3 consideration of the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill. Could I call on Graeme Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no member has asked to speak on the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 21173 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you very much. So we're going to turn now to Stage 3 proceedings for the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill. Can I just check that members have with them the bill as amended at Stage 2, the marshalled list and the grouping of amendments. As normal, the grouping bell, the division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes for the first division of the afternoon. The period for voting for that first division will be 30 seconds, but normally it will be a minute for the first division after a grouping or a debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press their request to speak button as soon as I call the group. So, turning to the bill itself and the marshalled list, can I call Amendment 19 in the name of John Finney, grouped with Amendments 23, 24, 25 and 26. John Finney to move Amendment 19 and to speak to all amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move Amendment 19. Presiding Officer, as we know, the pace of technological change in the field of biometric technologies is rapid. That's why it's vital that biometric technologies are expressly mentioned on the face of the bill. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and his colleagues for working with me to refine my amendments from Stage 2. The amendments now make clear that biometric technologies are as much a part of the Commissioner's scrutiny arrangements as biometric data, as I shall explain. Amendment 19 requires that when the Commissioner is reviewing the law, policy and practice relating to biometric data, or promoting public awareness of powers and duties that relevant policing bodies have in relation to biometric data, then the Commissioner must have regard to technology used or capable of being used for the purpose of acquiring, retaining, using or destroying biometric data. That phrase, capable of being used, is very important as it includes technology which is available for use but not yet deployed, such as facial recognition technology. The legal and ethical use of technology by Police Scotland is of course a matter which I and other members will view as being of great importance given its impact on human rights, such as the right to privacy. It is therefore important that this new Commissioner is able to provide views on such matters through reviews, the Code of Practice, reports and recommendations. With that in mind, Amendment 23 makes explicit that in a report issued under Section 15 of the Bill, the Commissioner may make a recommendation in relation to technologies used or capable of being used to collect, retain, use or destroy biometric data. Amendment 24 goes on to provide that where such a recommendation is made, then the Commissioner must rather than may, impose a requirement to respond on the relevant policing body. This is important for promoting transparency and accountability. These amendments work with the existing provisions in Section 16 so that the person on whom a requirement to respond is imposed must provide a written statement to the Commissioner setting out the action they are taking or not taking in response to the recommendation. Thereafter, the Commissioner is required to publish the written statement and lay it before Parliament, as already provided for in Section 17. Amendment 25 clarifies that where a recommendation issued under Section 15 does not relate to biometrics technology, then the Commissioner can choose whether or not to impose a requirement to respond. Amendment 26 is a minor consequential amendment associated with Amendment 24. Taken together, I believe that this is a package of amendments makes for a stronger scrutiny arrangements and greater transparency around the use and potential use of biometric technologies. I move Amendment 19. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Finney. No other member has indicated they wish to speak. Therefore, could I call on the Cabinet Secretary to respond?
Presiding Officer, just briefly at Stage 2, John Finney agreed to work with me to refine his intended amendments, which aim to make explicit reference to biometric technologies in the bill. I'm pleased that we were able to build on Mr Finney's original amendment to make it even more effective in terms of its coverage and relevance as far as the Commissioner's general functions are concerned. I would particularly highlight that, as Mr Finney has just explained, the amendment now covers both technology in use, but also importantly, technology capable of being used. This means, for example, as Mr Finney has already referenced, facial recognition technology, which is not currently being deployed by Police Scotland, but is certainly will be available for use by them in the future, could be deployed by Police Scotland in the future, and therefore the Commissioner could include guidance about facial recognition technology in the Code of Practice or carry out a review of the law which relates to the use of this technology. So I support very much this group of amendments in John Finney's name, and I urge others to support them as well.
Thank you very much. Does John Finney wish to add anything further?
Nothing to add. Thank you, President Officer.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We're going to turn now to Group 2, which are minor and technical amendments. Could I call Amendment 20 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 21, 9, 22, 12, 27 and 28. The Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 20 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move Amendment 20, and of course I will speak to all the amendments in my name. The amendments in my name really make minor and technical changes to the bill. Amendment 20 and 21 adjust Section 2, subsection 7, to move the definition of children and young persons from after the definition of vulnerable persons to before it. This just simply allows the list to be arranged alphabetically, and we know that civil servants love alphabetically ordering lists. The definition itself remains unchanged, therefore these amendments are for tidying up purposes. In a similar vein, Amendments 22 and 27 make a minor adjustment or adjustments to references to the Code of Practice at various points in the bill. Amendment 28 adjusts paragraph 11 of Schedule 1 so that the Commissioner must obtain the consent of the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body as to the number of staff which the Commissioner may appoint. This amendment provides a means for the SPCB to manage staff numbers to assure the efficiency of the Commissioner's office. I now turn to Amendments 9 and 12 in the name of Liam Kerr. These are technical amendments which I'm happy to support. Section 6A lists a number of issues which the Commissioner is to have regards to when preparing the Code of Practice. These matters are currently termed as quote-unquote principles. However, the matters are not framed as principles, and therefore Amendments 9 and 12 replace the reference to principles while still ensuring that regard is to be had to the importance of these matters. The amendments also remove the express reference to revised codes of practice so that revised codes are dealt with in a consistent way in the bill as provided for by my Amendments 22 and 27. So I'd like to thank Liam Kerr for agreeing at stage 2 to work with me and my officials on this amendment and getting to what I think is a very constructive space in this regard. So I move Amendment 20 in my name.
Thank you very much. And I call Liam Kerr to speak to Amendment 9 and the other amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for indicating his support for Amendments 9 and 12 in my name. These are, as he says, technical amendments which refine my Stage 2 amendments in relation to Section 6A of the Bill. At Stage 2, I inserted a requirement for the Commissioner to have regard to certain important high-level principles when preparing a Code of Practice. A new Section 6A was inserted in the Bill as a result. Now, through Amendment 12, I now propose to change the opening words to Section 6A so the Commissioner, when preparing a draft Code of Practice, is to have regard to the importance of the matters listed in that section, rather than referring to those matters as principles. That's because I recognise, as the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned, the matters listed in that amendment were not actually framed as principles. The new amendment preserves the importance of the matters listed, including the promotion and protection of human rights and ensuring the safety of individuals and communities. And it still requires the Commissioner to have regard to them when preparing a Code of Practice. And I'm sure... Yes, of course, Mr. Finney.
John Finney.
Thank you, President. I'm grateful for the member taking intervention. The member will recall that at Stage 2 we moved from from have regard to comply with all the arguments about the strengthening of that. Can the member explain, because I'm not persuaded at this time that moving to a situation where we have regard to the importance of is anything other than a downgrading of a principle. So it may just be semantics, and I'm not meaning to be pedantic with you on this issue, but you know, when you are talking about promoting and protecting human rights, when you're talking about the individual's rights to privacy, these seem to me to be core principles rather than something you should have regard to. Could you clarify that, please?
Liam Kerr.
Yes, of course. I'm very grateful to Mr. Finney for coming in. The way the amendment was originally drafted spoke to principles. It said you have to have regard to the following principles, but the list of what were designated as principles were not in fact framed as principles. So the redrafted amendment sets out that what follows are not to be considered to be principles, because they're not. It's a semantic point. What they are, in fact, are statements of this is what must be complied with. Does that make sense, Mr Finney? Have I explained that reasonably well? Or?
John Finney.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, to a point, Mr Cairn. Thank you for taking the intervention again. But surely it's a very sound principle that we should all be promoting and protecting human rights, rather than having regard to the importance of. I'm genuinely trying to understand, because I want this to be consensual, please.
Liam. No, and it is, I'm very grateful. It is an important point. The Amendment 6A, as drafted at stage 2, refers to the Commissioner having regard to the following principles. But then when you look at 6A, A to D, these are not, in fact, principles. The statements as drafted are not in the form of principles as such, which is why it would be semantically wrong to keep referring to them as the following principles, because they're not principles. So it's entirely a semantic point, and the amendment tidies that up such that the Commissioner, a draft code of practice, the Commissioner must have regard to the importance of the following things, which are not principles because they have not been drafted as principles. So I guess I'm slightly asking you to trust me on this one, Mr Finney. Come on. But semantically, the reason for the change is a semantic one, because as drafted at stage 2, it was referring to principles which are not principles. We'll see if you go with me on that one, Mr Finney. Amendment 12 also deletes the specific mention of revised codes in order to allow this to be dealt with in a uniform way across the bill, as the Cabinet Secretary proposes. But crucially, it remains the case that regard must be had to the importance of matters set out in Section 6A when preparing a revised code of practice. Amendment 9, on the other hand, is a consequential change. Because the reference to, quotes, principles is being removed from Section 6A, the reference to principles inserted to Section 6.1 is also to be removed. Finally, then, obviously, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for Justice for working with me to refine these amendments, and I would ask members to support Amendments 9 and 12 in my name.
Thank you very much. And could I call on the Cabinet Secretary to conclude in this, or wind up in this section? No further comments. In that case, we're going to move to the question. The question is that Amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 21 and ask the Cabinet Secretary to move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 21 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We're going to turn now to Group 3, which is an advisory group. Can I call Amendment 6 in the name of Liam MacArthur, grouped with Amendment 18, and Liam MacArthur to move Amendment 6 and speak to both amendments in this group.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Continuing in the generally consensual tone, Amendments 6 and 18 put the advisory group on a statutory footing. This was a recommendation unanimously supported by the committee, as well as many of the stakeholders and witnesses who gave evidence. Yet it appeared nowhere in the original bill, an omission described at the time by the Scottish Human Rights Commission as regrettable. At stage 2, the Cabinet Secretary committed in principle to putting this group on a statutory footing if work could be done to revise the wording. I accepted that proposal, and these amendments reflect that collaborative work. The new Section 22A allows the Commissioner to make decisions on governance, remuneration and membership of the group with the consent of the SPCB where appropriate. The new section would also allow for the group to provide advice on all matters relating to the Commissioner's functions. I believe this better reflects the approach of the bill in recognising the need to respond, as John Finney was referring to earlier, to a rapidly changing biometrics environment. And on that basis, I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for their assistance in coming to this point. Look forward to any further debate and would encourage Parliament to support Amendment 6, which I move.
Thank you very much. And I call, no other member has indicated they wish to speak, so I call on the Cabinet Secretary to respond.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At stage 2, Liam MacArthur agreed to work with me and my officials to refine his amendment, which, as he rightly says, of course, aimed to establish an advisory group to provide advice to the Commissioner on legal and ethical issues relating to biometric data and technologies. I'm pleased that we were able to make constructive adjustments to the stage 2 amendment, which will now simplify how the membership, remuneration and governance arrangements of the group are determined. They also allow for greater flexibility in the group's remit. I've always supported the setting up of such a group, as I very much recognise the importance of crucially independent but also well-informed advice being available to the Commissioner. My concern was that in committing this to legislation we risked losing some flexibility. However, Liam MacArthur's Amendment 18 now ensures that matters are kept as open and flexible as they can be. This Stage 3 amendment also removes the opportunity for Scottish ministers to steer the operation of the group and instead places the decision-making with the Commissioner, which is exactly as it should be. It's vital to the credibility of this group that it remains impartial and, of course, seen to be impartial. I also agree that there should be a role for the Scottish Parliament corporate body in overseeing and approving the appointments process, the number of members and the remuneration and allowances for the group to ensure transparency and value for money. So can I thank Liam MacArthur for the constructive way he's approached these amendments, and we were pleased to get to a resolution on them, and I hope that other members will support the amendments in Liam MacArthur's name.
Thank you. And does Liam MacArthur wish to make any concluding remarks?
I don't think it, no.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. We turn to Group 4, Complaints Procedure. Can I call Amendment 7 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, grouped with Amendment 5, and Margaret Mitchell to move Amendment 7 and speak to both amendments in this group?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendment 7 replaces in full the amendment that I lodged at Stage 2, which required the Commissioner to put in place a procedure by which a person may make a complaint to the Commissioner about the handling of their biometric data. My intention was to ensure that members of the public had the ability to complain directly to the Commissioner if they believed that their biometric data had not been properly dealt with by the police bodies which fall within the oversight of the Commissioner, and that remains my intention. However, I've listened very carefully to concerns expressed both by the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and the Information Commissioner's Office that it should be clear that the complaints made via the procedure are to relate to breaches of the Code of Practice, and I've worked with the Cabinet Secretary to ensure the provisions now make this clear. The remainder of the amendment is very similar to my Stage 2 amendment and broadly achieves the same aim, as I shall now explain. Amendment 7 requires the Commissioner to provide a procedure so that it's clear that the Commissioner is not just to establish a procedure but also to retain it. The procedure is to allow an individual or their representative to make a complaint about a breach of the Code of Practice in relation to that individual's biometric data. The procedure is to apply to complaints in respect of any body which is subject to the Code of Practice under Section 7(1). This flexibility will allow the provision to cover any additional bodies which may be made subject to the Code later by means of regulations under Section 7(4). The procedure is to be available whether or not the individual has already instigated a complaint through the complaints mechanism of the body they are complaining about. In determining the procedure, the Commissioner is to consult various persons, including the Information Commissioner. This provision recognises the importance of the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner and the Information Commissioner working together to ensure that complaints are directed to the appropriate Commissioner. The procedure put in place by the Biometrics Commissioner will deal with complaints regarding failures to comply with the Code, while the Information Commissioner will continue to deal with complaints about infringements of data protection legislation. Therefore, Amendment 7 sets out comprehensive arguments to enable individuals to raise complaints relating to the Code directly with the Commissioner. Amendment 5 moves the location of Section 5A so that it will now appear after Section 10 of the Bill among the sections which deal with the Code of Practice, as complaints procedure is now clearly about complaints relating to a breach of the Code of Practice. This is a more suitable location. I move Amendment 7 in my name.
Thank you very much. And I call James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I indicate support for the amendments in this group? And can I go on to state that I believe that if the Biometrics Commissioner is to have the confidence of the public, then it's important that we've got appropriate processes that underpin the Biometric Commissioner's work. One of the gaps in the original legislation was a lack of a complaints procedure, and the amendments at stage 2 addressed that. The amendments have been brought forward today by Margaret Mitchell, and I acknowledge the work that's gone with the Cabinet Secretary's team, refine and clarify the complaints procedure so that it's clear what complaints will go to the Information Commissioner and what complaints to the Biometrics Commissioner. So I think overall the package of amendments from stage 2 to stage 3 make the bill more stronger in this area.
Thank you very much, Mr Kelly. And can I call the Cabinet Secretary to respond on behalf of the Government?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the Chamber may be aware, I did not support the Stage 2 amendments which Margaret Mitchell brought forward, requiring the Commissioner to set up a complaints procedure. I was concerned at that time that the amendment could lead to duplication or disagreement between the Information Commissioner and the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner in relation to complaints about biometric data. This is because the Stage 2 amendment didn't delimit the role of the Biometrics Commissioner and would have allowed the Commissioner to deal with complaints about breaches of data protection law that should properly be dealt with by the Information Commissioner. However, I'm pleased that Margaret Mitchell has not only taken on board my concerns, but constructively worked with me and my officials, but also taken on board the concerns of the Information Commissioner as set out at Stage 2, so that the Stage 3 amendments now limit the complaints procedure, I think quite rightly, to breaches of the Code of Practice. The amendment also fixes a number of other technical points. So I thank Margaret Mitchell for working with me to refine the amendments for Stage 3, and I will be supporting Amendments 7 and 5 and urge others to do so as well.
Thank you very much. And can I ask if Margaret Mitchell wishes to make any concluding remarks?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just to say I welcome the Cabinet Secretary endorsement of these amendments, and I thank him and his officials for working collaboratively with me to improve this amendment. I think we're all agreed it's important that there should be a clear process for individuals to complain in relation to breaches of the Code of Practice which affect them directly, and happily the amendment before us does precisely that.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I also call Amendment 5 in the name of Margaret Mitchell? Margaret Mitchell to move.
Move.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Turn now to Group 5, Post-Legislative Scrutiny. Can I call Amendment 8 in the name of Lee MacArthur in a group on its own? Lee MacArthur to move and speak to the amendment.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendment 8 follows my Stage 2 amendment, allowing for a process of review. Amendment 8 fine-tunes what was passed at Stage 2 by making minor drafting changes and altering the timing requirements so that the reviews can be linked to the Commissioner's strategic plan. Where a review is considered unnecessary, my amendment would also require a statement to be made setting out the rationale for that. As I said at Stage 2, new biometric technologies are being developed at a pace that primary legislation cannot match. Putting in place a framework alongside mechanisms for reviewing and updating is therefore essential. Amnesty, the Law Society, open rights groups and the Scottish Human Rights Commission all raise concerns about the Commissioner's scope in their evidence, and this may indeed need to be revisited in due course. For now, I am again grateful to the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for working with me to put in place measures that will at least allow reviews to happen in the future. As the Law Society say in their briefing, these reviews should not be seen as a drain on resources, but, quote, necessary checks to ensure the high degree of transparency of the role which is required. I accept, however, that the most important thing is that these reviews are capable of responding to circumstances, and in some cases that may mean a review is not actually required. But at this point I move Amendment 8 in my name.
Thank you very much. And can I invite, no other members indicated they wish to speak, can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to respond?
Presiding Officer, at Stage 2, Lee MacArthur agreed to work with me to refine his amendment, which required Scottish Ministers to undertake a review of the Commissioner's remit and functions at recurring intervals. As I said at Stage 2, post-legislative scrutiny is of course extremely important. Also, I did say at Stage 2, I don't think the bill needs to provide for it. I think it is a matter better left to Ministers and Parliament to determine without being tied to predetermined periods. However, I recognise that the Parliament wishes to legislate for this now, and I respect that. I was therefore keen that we revisited the amendment to make sure that it would work in a sensible manner in a way that could achieve the most effective scrutiny possible. In adjusting that amendment, I'm pleased that Liam MacArthur recognises the benefit of linking the timing of the first post-legislative review to the end of the first strategic planning period, rather than to 3 years after royal assent. This allows the examination of the Commissioner's functions to be more meaningful and to consider whether the Commissioner has been able to achieve all they set out to achieve. Amendment 8 also recognises that there may be times when it's not necessary to conduct subsequent reviews, in which case Scottish ministers are able to publish a statement to that effect and lay that before Parliament. This allows for, I think, a very common sense approach while retaining the need for transparency, as Parliament would be able to question ministers about the decisions not to conduct a review. So I very much support Liam MacArthur's Amendment 8 and would urge all members to do likewise.
And can I ask Mr MacArthur if he wishes to make any concluding remarks?
I would just thank the Government for their support and move the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 9? This was debated earlier. Liam Kerr to move or no move? Moved. That is moved. The question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Turning now to Group 6 on the Code of Practice retention periods, can I call Amendment 10 in the name of Liam MacArthur, grouped with Amendment 11? Liam MacArthur to move Amendment 10 and speak to both amendments.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendments 10 and 11 are again a revised version of what I pressed at stage 2. They have been proposed in recognition of the fact that there is currently a gap in the regulation of retention periods of biometric data. While DNA and fingerprints are regulated under the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act 1995, photos and other forms of biometric data are not. During the passage of this bill, research by Scottish Liberal Democrats found that over 375,000 images had been supplied to the Police National Database from Police Scotland's criminal history system since 2014. Those images were uploaded without a clear legislative requirement for their deletion in the event of the person pictured being found innocent. I recognise that facial recognition could be valuable for modernising the way police investigate crime, but unregulated it represents a potentially serious threat to human rights and civil liberties. I believe these provisions will provide both a safeguard for those liberties and the necessary framework to allow the proportionate and legitimate use of these technologies. The Ada Lovelace Institute found that, quote, people fear the normalisation of surveillance but are prepared to accept facial recognition technology when there is a clear public benefit provided safeguards are in place. In evidence to the Justice Subcommittee, Temporary Assistant Chief Constable Duncan Sloan said that the current rules around what the police can do with images of the public are, quote, not as clear as the rules around fingerprints and DNA. He went on to add that new governance arrangements would be absolutely valued and very much welcomed. Mr Sloan's colleague, DSC Sean Scott, also supported the Independent Advisory Group's recommendation on a presumption for deletion of biometric data as a central part of the oversight system established by the bill. He stated that, quote, one of the IAG's 9 recommendations was about the retention periods and a presumption of deletion, and that is absolutely right. There needs to be enough flexibility to allow for specific circumstances to be taken into consideration. However, putting retention periods in black and white will not only strengthen privacy rights, but also public confidence in the use of these technologies. For public authorities, that provides a much better basis on which to deploy such technologies, and I move Amendment 10 in my name.
Thank you very much. And no other member has indicated they wish to speak. Could I call on the Cabinet Secretary to respond?
As the Chamber may be aware, I have committed to conducting a review of retention periods once the new Commissioner is in place. Therefore, I was very interested in the amendments lodged by Liam MacArthur at stage 2, which require the Code of Practice to provide for presumption of a fixed 3-year retention period for all biometric data. I had a number of concerns about that, as I set out in detail at stage 2, which is why I now welcome Liam MacArthur's more flexible amendment on retention periods, which allows what I think is more nuanced rules to be provided for. In particular, it will allow different periods to be specified in different cases and avoid settling now upon the period which must be specified. The new amendment will also ensure that the provision which the Code of Practice is required to make will be focused only on cases where there is an existing legislative gap. This will help to avoid the risk of contradictory legal provision being made. This is because it will avoid the code being required to set out rules on retention periods for types of biometric data which are already suitably covered by legislation. I support Liam McCarthy's amendments 10 and 11 and would urge members to vote in favour of them.
Thank you. And can I ask if Liam McCarthy wishes to add any comments?
No.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 22, in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, debated earlier, Cabinet Secretary to move?
Moved.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I invite Liam McArthur to move Amendment 11?
Moved.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I also ask Liam Kerr, to move Amendment 12, debated earlier?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. We're going to turn now to Group 7, reporting on failures to comply with the Code of Practice. Can I call Amendment 13 in the name of Liam McArthur, grouped with Amendments 14, 15, 16 and 17. Liam McArthur to move Amendment 13 and speak to all the amendments.
Thank you again, Presiding Officer. Amendments 13 to 17 would mean that under Section 15, the Commissioner is required to prepare and publish reports about failures by relevant bodies to comply with the Code of Practice. At stage 2, the Cabinet Secretary maintained that the Bill's strength can be found in the coercive powers of naming and shaming, observing that, quote, the power of reputational damage should not be underestimated. That always seemed to be open to too much of a risk, one that some might be willing to take, and I'm grateful, therefore, that Mr Youssef has come round to this view. In turn, I accept that these reports may be amalgamated, if appropriate, and should certainly recognise a de minimis threshold, not least to avoid any undue burden being placed upon the Commissioner. I'm pleased, however, that these amendments strike a proportionate balance, and a pleasure moving Amendment 13 in my name.
Thank you very much. And again, no member has indicated they wish to speak. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to respond on behalf of the Government?
Well, just very briefly, Presiding Officer, Liam McArthur has already said this group of amendments in his name requires the Commissioner to prepare and publish a report about failures to comply with the Code of Practice, removing the discretionary power to prepare and publish reports in that regard. Monitoring and reporting in compliance with the Code of Practice has always been expected to be a key aspect of the Commissioner's role, and therefore I take no issue with these amendments at all. I'm very pleased, as Liam McArthur has already alluded to, that we have, I think, a very now practical approach that's been built onto the amendments, so that the Commissioner can choose not to report on a failure where it may be a very minor infraction, and also so that combined reports may be produced on failures to comply by more than one person, such as where there's a common theme, for example. So I support very much these amendments and thank Liam McArthur for working constructively with me and my officials to refine them for Stage 3, and hope other members will also support.
Thank you very much. Liam McArthur, any further comments to conclude?
Only to thank the Government again for the cooperation. I suspect that the workings of these provisions may be something that will be reviewed in future, depending on the evidence that's forthcoming. But again, very much welcome the support the Government's given to coming to this point.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I ask Liam McArthur to move Amendment 14?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I ask Liam McArthur to move Amendment 15?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I invite Liam McArthur to move Amendment 16?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. Can I ask John Finney to move Amendment 23, debated earlier?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And could I ask John Finney to move Amendment 24, also debated earlier?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. That is moved. The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Could I invite Liam McArthur to move Amendment 17?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I invite John Finney to move Amendment 25, debated earlier?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I invite John Finney to move Amendment 26?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I ask Liam MacArthur to move Amendment 18, debated earlier?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Could I ask the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 27, debated earlier?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 28, also debated earlier?
Moved.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 28 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed, and that ends consideration of amendments. Now, as members will be aware, at this stage in proceedings, I may require understanding orders to decide whether or not any provision in this bill relates to a protected subject matter. That is, whether it amends the franchise or the electoral system for Scottish parliamentary elections. In the case of this bill, in my view, no provision does any such thing. Therefore, the bill does not require a supermajority to be passed at stage 3. Now, we're going to move on to the next item of business. Can I just check with members? Are we quite happy to move on? Should we are. All right, we'll just take a short pause and then we'll move on. A short pause.
Thank you. The next item of business is a stage 3 debate on motion 21174 in the name of Hamza Yousaf on the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons down? I call on Hamza Yousaf to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to open this stage 3 debate on the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill. Can I thank my officials, of course, for the drafting of this bill, working so constructively with members of the opposition. Can I also thank members of the opposition for also similarly taking such a constructive approach. I've been involved in introducing legislation to this Parliament as a Minister for just over 7.5 years, and I don't think I've ever passed a bill with so much consensus and no voting against a single amendment during stage 3. It's only taken me 7.5 years to get there, but I'm delighted we have got to that. And on an issue that is understandably, I think, quite contentious and often quite controversial. But what we have now is an important piece of legislation which speaks to some of the very key societal issues of our time, touching on human rights, ethics, as they relate to police use of very personal information. A hugely topical issue, and one that I suspect members right across this chamber have been approached by members of the public in their own constituencies many at a time. The origins of this bill, however, go back a number of years, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank John Scott and his advisory group for shining a spotlight on biometric data and policing and criminal justice. Their report in 2018 was very much at the genesis, the inspiration for this bill. I'd also like to thank the various parliamentary committees who scrutinised this bill and its accompanying documents, especially, of course, the convener Margaret Mitchell on the Justice Committee. This bill, quite rightly, has attracted interest from a wide range of organisations and individuals. I'm again grateful to those stakeholders for their considered views they offered the Scottish Government during the preparatory phase of the bill, and also to the Justice Committee once the bill was introduced to Parliament. I was pleased that there was a broad consensus to agree the general principles of the bill in January. The Justice Committee did, however, make a number of detailed recommendations in its Stage 1 report, and I'm pleased to have been able to work with members to address those concerns during Stage 1, during Stage 2, and getting to this important stage today. I therefore welcome the cross-party support for the bill and the very positive engagement I've had with parliamentarians to ensure that the new legislation does what we want it to do. The bill will go a long way to delivering greater transparency and accountability in how the police use biometric data in Scotland, and to recognising how important this is to building and maintaining public trust. And I cannot stress enough how important it is that, on the one hand, we absolutely equip our police officers with the necessary technology to ensure they can keep us safe. However, on the other hand, equally, let me stress how important it is that the public have absolute confidence in those technological advances and how their data will be collected, retained, or indeed disposed. This bill, the new independent commissioner and the code of practice will hopefully help to provide members of the public with the reassurances they require. In this afternoon's debate, I want to focus on some key areas of the bill and what we want to achieve through it. First and foremost, the bill will make sure that our approach to biometric data, including new technologies such as facial recognition software, which has already been mentioned today, is effective, proportionate and, crucially, ethical. The bill creates an independent commissioner to advise on these issues and to review the relevant law, policy and practice. The policing bodies which the Commissioner will oversee are Police Scotland, the Scottish Police Authority, the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner, but the bill includes a power so that ministers can add further bodies which operate in the context of policing and criminal justice at a later date, should that be required. And I absolutely think that policing, and these bodies in particular, are the absolute right place to start, because we know the collection, the retention of data for policing purposes can be very, very different to the collection and retention of personal data, or indeed biometric data, by any other sector. The Commissioner will also prepare a statutory code of practice which will set out mandatory standards these bodies must meet and the responsibilities they must undertake, with the aims of ensuring good practice, driving continuous improvement and enhancing accountability. The content of the code has deliberately not been specified in the bill. This is to allow for flexibility and future-proofing. We are all aware of how quickly the pace of technology can move, but also to preserve, which I think is crucial, the impartiality and independence of the Commissioner, allowing the Commissioner to use his or her own judgment in the future. The Commissioner can also draw on expertise from the statutory advisory group. Any draft code of practice will be subject to consultation with specified bodies and to the approval of this Parliament before coming into effect. The code will be published so that everyone can see the standards that are expected of the bodies mentioned in the bill. The Commissioner will have powers to obtain information and to make reports and recommendations. I expect that the relationship between bodies subject to the code of practice and the Commissioner will therefore be predicated on transparency and accountability. And we heard at stage 2 evidence gathering, before stage 2, sorry, at stage 1, during the evidence gathering stage, how important that dynamic between the bodies and the Commissioner was when we heard from the English and Welsh Commissioner. There will be a complaints procedure as well, as we've just heard, so that members of the public can raise concerns with the Commissioner about failures to comply with the Code of Practice. The Commissioner will also have substantial powers, I would say have teeth. They can report any failures to comply to Parliament, as well as issuing compliance notices requiring that any concerns be addressed. In the most extreme cases, the Commissioner can ultimately report failures to comply to the Court of Session. Finally, but importantly, the Commissioner will play a major role in raising public awareness about rights, responsibilities and standards used in biometric data and technologies. Given the rapid increase in the use of biometric data and technologies in recent years, it's absolutely vital that we promote a clearer understanding of these issues in our communities, especially, I would say, for young people, but also for vulnerable people as well. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the biometrics field is evolving rapidly. It offers great potential, of course, in detection, prevention and the prosecution of crime, which keeps our communities safe. But the use of biometric data and the technologies also raises ethical and human rights considerations. Therefore, I want to make sure that the use of biometric data, including new technologies such as facial recognition software, is effective, it is lawful and is ethical. The bill creates a Biometrics Commissioner whose powers and duties are focused on rights, accountabilities and responsibilities. And since the bill was introduced, there's been a lot of discussion here at Parliament about biometric data, but it's now time, I think, to absolutely have that national discussion about the ethics and human rights associated with police use of biometric data, and for the new Commissioner to absolutely lead the forefront that discussion. So if Parliament agrees to this bill today, then this will place Scotland, I think, at the forefront of driving forward transparency, accountability and improvement in relation to biometric data for policing and criminal justice purposes. And I thank once again members for working extremely constructively to get us to this stage. I move that the Parliament agrees that a Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill be passed today.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Now call Liam Kerr to open for the Conservatives. Mr Kerr, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to open this Stage 3 debate on the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. I confirm we will be voting for it to pass at decision time tonight. The underlying principle of this bill is to address ethical and human rights considerations in Scotland in relation to the collection, use, retention and disposal of biometric data in the context of policing and criminal justice. It seeks to do this by establishing the post of a Scottish Biometrics Commissioner who will draw up a code of practice governing how biometric material should be used, gathered and so on. This is a significant role. The bill also seeks to underpin public trust in the way the police use biometric data, and that trust is recognised in the bill's policy memorandum, where being seen to promote the confidence of the public was essential in relation to the Commissioner's functions, requiring that the governance arrangements for the Commissioner must be, and be seen to be, transparent, accountable and free of any undue influence. We all no doubt hope that that can be achieved. And ultimately, whether or not it is, will at least partly be around the resourcing. As the Law Society says, resources need to include funding for research, public consultations, marketing and legal advice. Promoting and knowledge of the Commissioner's role is going to be very important. The committee's report was stark. Other SPCB-supported office holders have faced resourcing issues as a result of changes or expansion to their role and powers over time, or as a result of growing demand for activity. So the committee's conclusion that the financial memorandum may not sufficiently estimate the resources which may be needed to support the delivery of the Commissioner's functions remains a concern, not least because I've read with interest the supplementary financial memorandum, which projects an extra couple of £100,000 due to the Stage 2 amendments. Now, I note section 22 on the preparation of an annual report, but this doesn't mandate an explicit requirement to report on the adequacy of resources. That remains a concern, and I hope we'd see the Commissioner going wide in the interpretation of section 22 to include those issues of resources. Moving on, the Code of Practice is of course fundamental and set out in section 6. This has been a major area for amendment, and rightly so. During this process, the Cabinet Secretary amended the bill to provide greater parliamentary scrutiny of the first Code of Practice by ensuring the Commissioner must lay a copy of the first draft code before Parliament for representations. That's a good development, and one which should help towards the public trust and accountability desired. Within that Code of Practice, the committee agreed that the promotion and protection of human rights, privacy, public confidence and community safety are crucial. Noting that, at Stage 2, I inserted a requirement for the Commissioner to have regard to these when preparing a Code of Practice. And I'm very pleased that the Parliament agreed my further amendments early this afternoon, and that John Finney trusts me enough that the clause is as tight as it can be. And on that note, I think Liam MacArthur's points and amendments around the Code of Practice retention periods particularly are well made, and the greater nuance that we built in this afternoon is welcome. Now, at Stage 1, many on the committee raised concerns about a complaint mechanism and the possible impact on public confidence of not having one. Initially, the bill didn't contain any provision whereby a member of the public could raise concerns about the use of their biometric data by the police or a breach of the Code of Practice with the Commissioner. As such, the committee recommended that a complaint mechanism be included in the bill. Margaret Mitchell amended the bill to include a complaints process, which we further amended today. She'll talk in greater detail later, but I believe it's welcome that the Commissioner is required to establish and retain a complaints procedure which allows people to make a complaint to the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner about a breach of the Code of Practice. The amendment also states the Commissioner is to publicise the procedure, which will help raise public awareness of their rights relating to biometric data use by the police and justice system. Finally, Presiding Officer, it is trite that biometric data is developing all the time and changing. None of us can possibly know what the category biometric data will comprise in the future. Building in future-proofing in connection with the Commissioner's role and functions is essential. And that's why Liam MacArthur's section 22A amendment at Stage 2 regarding an ethics advisory group was welcomed. He has, of course, further amended that today to create an advisory group which will allow the Commissioner more flexibility. Staying with Mr MacArthur, he included at Stage 2 Section 5B of the bill to allow the powers and functions of the Commissioner to be reviewed 3 years after the bill received royal assent and at the end of 5 years after review under that section. His amendment today, which tightened that up and links it to the publication of the Commissioner's strategic plan, makes sense and I think should be welcome. In summary, Presiding Officer, this is a good bill which has been subject to considered and sensible amendments throughout this legislative process, following extensive and exhaustive evidence taking at the committee stage. There followed reflective and collaborative working, as mentioned earlier by the Cabinet Secretary. And it's my view that what has emerged is a strong piece of legislation which achieves its stated aims to establish the Office of Scottish Biometrics Commissioner and to provide for its functions in relation to the acquisition, retention, use and destruction of biometric data for criminal justice and police purposes. And for that reason, Presiding Officer, we shall support it at decision time this evening.
Thank you very much, Mr Kelly. I call on James Kelly to open for Labour. Mr Kelly, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to open the Stage 3 debate on behalf of Scottish Labour and confirm that Scottish Labour will be supporting the bill at decision time this evening. And I've enjoyed this afternoon's very consensual proceedings. I mean, I think the advance of technology, John Finney was right earlier on when he spoke in one of his amendments to separate out technology and data. So there's been dramatic advances in technology, which therefore have ensured that data can be, much more data can be collected, and you know, data can be held more easily. And that is of great advantage in the criminal justice system. It helps police and prosecutors do their jobs in bringing people to justice and giving victims reassurance where they have, you know, they've had to suffer as a result of unjust crimes. However, the other side of that is that there's an ethics, as the Cabinet Secretary said, there's an ethics and human rights side to this, in that a lot more data has been held, and we have to ensure that the ethics that underpin that are robust and that people's human rights are not being undermined. And it's against that backdrop that the objectives of the bill are absolutely correct in setting up a biometrics commissioner to oversee the collection and retention of biometrics data. I think the process has been interesting. You know, I think the government have worked collaboratively with all parties and also with the committee, and we've seen the bill strengthened as it's gone through stage 2 and stage 3, and I think that's how the parliamentary process should work. I think particularly in regard to compliance, and originally the way the bill was drafted, it basically stated that the Biometrics Commissioner needed to have regard people need to have regard to the work of the Biometrics Commissioner, and we had a great debate in the committee around whether have regard was strong enough, and I certainly argued that there should be stronger compliance than have regard, and that amendments with that theme in it were passed at stage 2, and I think that does make the compliance much stronger. Similarly, in regard to the complaints process, that was a gap in the original drafting of the bill. I think it was well intentioned from the point of view that it was felt that the Information Commissioner could deal with any complaints. However, I think as a number of contributors have said this afternoon, it's important to ensure public confidence, and potentially that public confidence could have been undermined by the lack of a direct complaints process to the Biometrics Commissioner, where people felt there were issues around the way their data was being held. So the amendments that have been brought through at stage 2 and then refined at stage 3 build a proper complaints process in, and also give clarity around what complaints are relevant to the Information Commissioner and what complaints go to the Biometrics Commissioner. I think another important aspect is the importance of the advisory group. As a Law Society cited in their submission, future-proofing in this area is very important to take account of new developments in technology, and it's important to be able to draw on relevant expertise, and from that point of view the setting up of an advisory group is something that makes the process much more robust. And I think being able to keep all that under review, including the issues of resources, will also ensure that all these issues are taken into account. So in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think the process has been a good and positive one for the Parliament and also for the Government in taking the bill through the Parliament, building on some of the discussions and the evidence that has taken place and making the end product a robust one which Parliament and the public will have confidence in.
Thank you very much, Mr Kelly. I call on John Finney to open for the Green Party.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. A lot of similarity, I'm sure, with a lot of what we're going to say. Can I agree with the Cabinet Secretary, the good work of John Scott and QC and his committee that gets us to this point? And the point we're at is where we're going to pass, hopefully, and the Scottish Green Party will certainly be supporting it, a piece of legislation that will establish a new Biometrics Commissioner. And the explanatory note is very specific, as you would imagine. It says, who will support and promote the adoption of lawful, effective and ethical practices in relation to biometric data in a policing and criminal justice context, and do so by keeping under review the law, policy and practice relating to acquisition, retention, use and destruction. Now, as has been said by others, I think public confidence in our criminal justice system is vital, and the way that this bill has been progressed, it starts off as a sound enough piece of legislation, but the engagement that there's been, I think, has been extremely positive, and dare I say it, a fine example of how the committee system can work, and the engagement with the Cabinet Secretary and his colleagues is appreciated. So I think it is the stronger as a result of what's taken place. The policy memorandum talks about how rapidly evolving this is an area of work, and as has been said, it's right to strike a balance and say that elsewhere, and I quote here, greater potential in detection, prevention and prosecution of crime. And we would all see that, and we would know that in the last 30 years DNA testing has resulted in, has been central to serious crime, murder and sexual offences being solved. And in that period, of course, we've seen laptops, phones, CCTV, security cameras, road cameras, automatic number plate recognition, collecting, storing and using large volumes of biometric data. So I think it was right in the Justice Committee Stage 1 report when we said that this was timely and necessary, this piece of legislation. And that the oversight will be of the various things, as the reference has been made to facial recognition, facial search technology, gait and movement recognition technology, eye, iris, retinal identification, voice recognition software, and data from social media that's capable of providing sources to the police. Second generation, I'm advised. And it's important that this functions independently. This was said in the report, with no perceptions of overt influence from police-relating bodies. And I think, excuse me, the amendment at stage 2, which saw a requirement to comply, is significant because I went back today and I had a look what police were telling us, and police told us, and they were relaxed with I have regard to, they were saying this is similar to recommendations coming from HMC, ICS, and they said, quote, we generally work to implement its recommendations. There can't be discussions about this. These are very, very important matters, and one of the policy objectives outlined in the legislation was improving the accountability of the police. So I'm pleased that policing in Scotland, excuse me, will include the British Transport Police, and that PERC are involved given their pivotal role in this. The Independent Advisory Group talked about a complaint mechanism within the bill, so I was very keen to support our convener in the very important amendments that's been brought forward. The group been put in statutory footing, the Liam MacArthur's amendments, I think, and the advice and information source that they can provide, I think, is very important. The Scottish public's under heavy surveillance, and it's very important that we get things right. So I particularly thank the Scottish Government for working with me on the technology amendments. I think this is a good piece of legislation, and we'll support it at decision time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Liam MacArthur over to the Liberal Democrats. Mr MacArthur, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I echo the comments of others in confirming that Scottish Liberal Democrats warmly welcome the bill and be supporting it at decision time shortly. And again, can I thank all those who helped the committee during the process of our scrutiny, and like the Cabinet Secretary and John Finney, pay particular tribute to John Scott and his colleagues on the advisory group for the work that they did in laying the foundations. Can I also thank the Cabinet Secretary for the very constructive approach that he adopted in relation to this bill. I mean, given how competitive our exchanges around policing can get in this chamber, it is quite nice to have the experience that I think we've gone through in relation to this bill. The case for establishing a Biometrics Commissioner to oversee the collection, use, retention and, importantly, deletion of biometrics is well made and now, I think, widely accepted. Biometrics is an area of policy that is complex, highly technical, and where technology and its use are evolving at an astonishing pace. The robust regulatory framework and the specific expertise to oversee it are non-negotiables if we are to retain public confidence, while also allowing our police and the justice system to have access to the tools that they will increasingly need. Thanks to legislation passed in 2006 and 2010, we already have a legal framework governing the use of DNA and fingerprints. In 2015, however, it emerged that pictures of 330,000 Scots who had been taken into custody had been made available to users of the Police National Database. Many of the individuals concerned had done nothing wrong, and this prompted my colleague Alison McInnes to spearhead a campaign for effective regulation of biometrics. She wrote to the First Minister at the time demanding a review of facial recognition technology, leading to HMICS undertaking their assessment. During consideration of the 2016 Criminal Justice Act, Alison McInnes lodged amendments to make biometric information subject to the same rules as DNA and fingerprints. She recognised the importance of consistency, including around the timely deletion of images. Although unsuccessful, Alison McInnes' efforts paved the way for my own amendments passed by Parliament earlier this afternoon, and these will achieve consistency, a consistency that is in the interests not just of individuals and the wider public, but indeed the police, who have been clear in their belief that what's needed is both consistency and clarity, albeit with some flexibility, as the Cabinet Secretary mentioned earlier, to deal with specific circumstances. I acknowledge the support from the Scottish Government on these changes, as I do over the moves to put the proposed advisory group on a statutory footing. As I said in moving my amendments earlier, putting this group on the face of the bill sends a strong signal about the importance its work has in helping underpin all that the Commissioner does. This better reflects the recommendations of the IAG and hopefully addresses what was described by the Scottish Human Rights Commission as a regrettable omission from the original bill. Likewise, I think we've made progress today on the question of enforcement powers. I appreciate some stakeholders may wish to have seen us go further, while previously the Government had argued that the threat of naming and shaming was sufficient by way of a deterrent. By agreeing to ensure that breaches are made public by the Commissioner, safer in the most minor of circumstances, however, I believe we increase the likelihood of encouraging good practice and reduce the risk of individuals or organisations seeking to chance their arm. And the final area where I think an important step in the right direction has been taken today relates to the way in which we ensure this legislation keeps pace with the development of biometrics. Putting in place a robust regulatory framework is essential, as is ensuring it is overseen by those with the necessary expertise. However, there's no getting away from the fact that biometrics is rapidly evolving. We need to make sure that reviews are built in so that the public can have confidence that the framework and safeguards remain fit for purpose. And again, I welcome the Government and Parliament's support for my amendments to allow such a review mechanism. Deputy Presiding Officer, Met Commissioner Dame Cressida Dick observed that while police should take advantage of new technology to improve policing, it is not for the police service to draw up the rules by which that technology is used. She is right, but so too are Amnesty International when they warn that use of biometrics has the potential to breach human rights such as the right to privacy, freedom of association and the right to peaceful assembly. That is why we need a robust regulatory framework and a Biometrics Commissioner with the necessary powers. And I believe that this bill gives us gets us much of the way there. The Scottish Liberal Democrats on that basis will be supporting the bill this evening.
Thank you, Mr MacArthur. And I call Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As Deputy Convener of the Justice Committee, I'm glad we've reached the final stage of this very important bill in a largely consensual way, as the Cabinet Secretary said. Can I thank the Clerks and Bill team for their hard work and thank the many excellent witnesses for helping us with their expertise in this field. A lot of work and a lot of listening has gone into getting the bill to a stage where we have thankfully achieved cross-party support. And I agree with Liam MacArthur that it is now a much better and a more balanced bill. The bill will ensure that the use of biometric data in policing and criminal justice is effective, lawful and ethical. It's vital that the public have confidence in the bill and that the ethics in respect of human rights surrounding the bill have been addressed. The scope of the bill covers the acquisition, use, retention and disposal of biometric data, including fingerprints, DNA and current emerging techniques such as iris recognition. The ultimate goal is to keep communities safe while respecting the rights of the individual and improving the accountability of the police. These are the important elements in maintaining public confidence in police use of biometric data. And it is hugely important in prevention, detection and prosecuting of crime. Of course, the use of biometrics identification by police is not a new phenomenon. In Scotland, police services have been using criminal history photographs and fingerprints for more than 100 years. And over the last 30 years, the use of human DNA testing has become a central tool in detecting and prosecuting crime, particularly serious crimes such as murder and sexual offences. So the need for a commissioner independent of government, the police and the criminal justice system was a key recommendation in both the 2016 HMICS review and the 2018 Independent Advisory Group report, and was widely welcomed by all witnesses who gave evidence to the committee. The Commissioner for the Retention and Use of Biometric Materials, Professor Wells, stated that the bill places Scotland at the forefront of legislating for the oversight of biometric data in the field of criminal justice. He said many other countries are quite interested in what Scotland is doing because they're all aware that they will have similar issues. So, Presiding Officer, important amendments were made at stage 2 and the Government has worked with members across the Chamber to incorporate their requests to shape the bill in the best possible form. So much of what I'll say has already been said, but here's a sample of some of the agreed amendments brought forward. It was amended to enable Scottish ministers to change or clarify the meaning of biometric data by regulations. This will allow Parliament to scrutinise any changes that Scottish ministers propose as technology advances at pace. An amendment was also agreed to allow for further process in the first Code of Practice being agreed by Parliament as recommended by the committee. Parliament agreed at stage 2 to add the PERT to the list of bodies, and I think that's important, subject to the Commissioner's oversight. Amendments were also voted in to require the Commissioner to set up a complaints procedure and to operate an advisory group. And as we've heard, the complaints procedure was one of the things that was discussed strongly, featured strongly, and I'm pleased that the Convener's Amendment has been passed. The committee accepted the Scottish Government's amendments to enhance the existing powers of the Commissioner to deal with failures to comply with the Code of Practice. The bill was amended to establish an advisory group, again something the committee felt strongly about. So this removes the any role for the Scottish ministers and instead allows the Commissioner to make decisions on the administration and procedure of the group, and also in remuneration and membership with the consent of the SPCB. So the intention is that this makes for a more impartial group whose remit and membership are tailored to the requirements of the Commissioner. Presiding Officer, I believe this important bill ensures that this Parliament has future-proofed and locked in all the necessary safeguards necessary for Scotland to deal with the evolving technology now necessary for the detection, prevention and prosecution of crime. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Closing speeches, I call on James Kelly to close for Labour. Mr Kelly, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Pleased to close in this debate on behalf of the Scottish Labour Party. We will be supporting the passage of the bill at decision time, which comes up shortly. I think it's been a very useful and an example of a good way for a bill to progress through the Parliament. It's been a very consensual discussion this afternoon. However, at the earlier stages, there were differences of opinion. Those were exchanged in a collegiate manner, and I'm glad to say that a lot of the differences of opinion, there's been a consensual way forward worked out, which I think is to the credit of the Cabinet Secretary and also to the opposition spokespeople and the Justice Committee for the way that the process has been conducted. I was struck when John Finney was speaking when he he railed through all the different sort of technology that's now available to police and prosecutors in terms of collecting data. And it took me back to the first kind of job I effectively had was with Greater Glasgow Health Board in 1982, and when I went into the office there was only one computer in the whole office. And when you hear John Finney railing off what's available now, both in terms of laptops, mobile technology, voice recognition, and of course we've got the advent of facial recognition technology, that means that the police have a lot more at their disposal, which is good in terms of investigating crime and bringing people who have committed those crimes to justice. However, it then means that the challenges are much more great in terms of ensuring that the ethics and human rights are not compromised. And from that point of view, this bill has got a very important role to play. And that kind of links into getting this right is important, as Liam Kerr stressed, in terms of winning the public trust. Because if the public are going to have proper confidence in this area of data, biometric data, then the role of a biometrics commissioner can help in that regard. I can't stress enough how the powers potentially that police and prosecutors have got in terms of being able to collect and retain data, and being able to use that properly and responsibly is of great advantage to the victims of crime, but they also must ensure that they've got public trust. The Cabinet Secretary in that regard emphasised the importance of expertise, and I think some of the changes that have been made as we've moved through the process will be able to draw on that expertise. So the setting up of an advisory group and the passing of the amendments that Liam MacArthur brought forward at stage 2 and stage 3 will help. I also think that the process has been enhanced by greater compliance measures been introduced by the bill that we'll consider shortly at decision time. I think the introduction of a proper complaints process, which streamlines it along the proper routes for the Biometrics Commissioner and the Information Commissioner is helpful. And I do think that, as Liam Kerr pointed out, the issue of resources is an important one, and that should be kept under review. And the review process that's built into the bill will help in that regard. So pleased to support the passage of this bill at decision time. I think the process has been a good one, and we now have a more robust process in place, which the public, I'm sure, will have confidence in.
Thank you. And I call on Margaret Mitchell to close the Conservatives. Ms Mitchell.
Officer, can I start by welcoming the introduction of the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill. Digital technology has advanced considerably over the past 25 years, and biometrics is one of the most rapidly developing technologies. Biometric data itself is both highly sensitive and intrusive data. It's evolved from first generation biometrics, such as fingerprints and DNA, to second generation technology like facial recognition software, which presents both opportunities and challenges. There is therefore a need for a balance between ensuring that the police have the tools they need to keep the public safe, while also protecting individuals' privacy. And here I'd like to thank the Justice Clerks for the sterling work that they've done assisting the committee achieve that balance. The bill provides that the Commissioner has several different functions: a general role to support and promote the adoption of lawful, effective and ethical practices of biometric data by the police and criminal justice system. This includes how biometric data is acquired, used, retained and destroyed. Moreover, the bill tasks the Commissioner with keeping under review the laws, policies, practices relating to biometric data by Police Scotland, the SPA and PERC, And furthermore, the Commissioner must prepare, promote, monitor compliance with the Code of Practice and promote public awareness and understanding of Police Scotland's, the SPA and PERC's powers and duties relating to biometric data. These powers ensure that the Commissioner is able to hold the police and criminal justice system to account for their use of biometrics. The Bill's Code of Practice governs the collection, use and retention of public's biometric data by the police. And after hearing the evidence presented at Stage 1, the Justice Committee deemed that the inclusion of a complaints mechanism was essential to ensure that any member of the public could raise their concern with the Commissioner about police compliance or possible breaches of the Code of Practice. And I want to thank the Cabinet Secretary for responding positively to my amendment, putting in place the complaints procedure, and for the collaborative manner in which the Scottish Government and its officials have worked with me to amend and improve this provision in the bill. The Commissioner will be required to publicise this complaints procedure. This should increase public awareness of their rights and bolster public confidence in the use of biometrics by the police. In the Stage 1 report, the committee also stressed that the bill would need to be strengthened in order to ensure that the Commissioner is able to provide robust oversight. So other improvements, therefore, include John Finney's amendment, which provides Police Scotland, the SP and PERC have a duty to comply with the Code of Practice, and amendments also by John Finney, which future-proof the use of different new technology. And Liam MacArthur's amendment, including a presumption in favour of the deletion of biometrics after a prescribed minimum retention period where there is a gap in the law in this respect, and the creation of an independent advisory group with oversight both open and flexible. So in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, the Justice Committee's scrutiny of the Scottish Commissioner, Scottish Biometric Commissioner Bill has, I believe, been an example of effective and collaborative and cooperative working between the committee and the Scottish Government to ensure that the legislation is fit for purpose. And I think it's one of the best examples of how this Parliament can work effectively to get the very best legislation possible. And the Scottish Conservatives will have much pleasure in supporting the bill this evening.
Thank you, Ms Mitchell. I call on Hamza Youssef to close the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm really grateful for members for their contributions and what's been a very constructive, consensual debate. As I said in my opening remarks, the bill has enjoyed strong cross-party support from the start, but that doesn't happen by accident, as members have alluded to. It happens because of the open-mindedness of opposition members. I hope also they recognise the open-mindedness of Scottish Government, but really I want to thank those that we don't often hear about or don't often see at the forefront. They are, for example, the clerks at the Justice Committee, officials led ably by Elaine Hamilton, David Scott, Laura Barry from PCO and David Murdoch, SGLD, and the whole team behind them, but also to get that cross-party support. Let me make a special mention of that much maligned political creature, the SPAD, the Special Advisor, John McFarlane, very well known to each of the opposition spokespeople here, who's done an excellent job actually of working with my officials and myself and opposition members to get this bill to a place, as I say, that where every single amendment at Stage 3 has been accepted by every member. That is a really positive place for this bill to be. But I take Margaret Mitchell's point as well, that this bill was not just about consensus. I'm pleased we've got to that point. It was about effective scrutiny. We saw that effective scrutiny from the Justice Committee. We saw the range of views from the stakeholders, and some of those stakeholders continue to challenge us. The Scottish Human Rights Commission, for example, continue to challenge us, and no doubt will continue the engagement once that independent biometrics commissioner is very much appointed. I just wanted to focus on a few remarks made by speakers today. Liam Kerr, I thought, very importantly focused his remarks on public trust. Hugely important, of course, because all of us can think of examples of data breaches, data leaks, and of course, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, many of us undoubtedly have been approached by members of the public around their concerns around data privacy, and therefore public trust has to be at the forefront of what we do. So therefore, having an independent commissioner with that oversight over biometrics data, I think will help to give those reassurances and strengthen public trust. Ultimately in policing, whenever I speak to the Chief Constable, or indeed anybody involved in policing, but particularly the Chief Constable, I know he always references the fact that he gets policing get their consent from the people. They don't get consent from the government, they don't get consent from Parliament. The consent for policing, the legitimacy of policing, comes from consent from the people, and therefore that can only happen when you have public trust. So I thought it was an important point made by Liam Kerr. He did ask me about finances and resources, and James Kelly in his closing remarks also asked about that, and I just reiterate what I've said before, that it's right, of course, that the government keeps under review any representations that are made, for example, by the SPCB in respect to the resourcing provision of the Office of the Commissioner as part of the annual budget setting process. But also, I'm very confident that the costings in the financial memorandum and supplementary financial memorandum are comprehensive. They do represent the best estimates at the time present, but clearly the Commissioner, he or she, will produce the code of practice, and therefore we'll have to keep that under review, and I think that's important. James Kelly, I thought, made some excellent remarks around how we have a stronger bill because of that collaboration, but that we have a stronger, and we will have a stronger Commissioner because of those changes. So those changes, and he referenced, I thought, the important changes that we've made in relation to the Commissioner having regards to the code of practice. Sorry, not the Commissioner, policing bodies having regards to the code of practice, to now having to comply with that code of practice. And I agree with him that has led to a stronger bill, but hopefully a stronger Commissioner and a stronger regulatory framework around biometrics. John Finney was absolutely right to make the point about the fact that we have this legislation is both timely but also necessary. I know, to his credit, John Finney has often been at the forefront in relation to human rights, and I think he pushed us, the government, very hard on these matters during committee stage in particular, and I hope that we have met not just his expectations, but rightly many of the human rights organisations the length and breadth of the country. John Finney was also right to make mention of the pace at which technology changes. Dare I say it, when he first became a police officer in 1976 and Lothian Borders Constabulary, and then of course a dog handler in Northern Constabulary. Of course, he only at the age of 5, I should say, presiding officer, that he would not have envisaged the pace at which technology has advanced, and that of course police officers are now faced with. And I think that's a really important point, because as the chair of the Serious Organised Crime Task Force, I know that police are always wanting to ensure and investing to ensure that they keep up to pace with criminals, because the criminal serious organised crime gangs, they do not have to worry about ethics. Of course they don't. They don't have to worry about procurement rules. They don't have to worry about legislation. They procure the technology that they require to make the criminal transactions that they do through the black market. So it's essential that we allow the police the ability to invest in technology to keep a pace or be ahead of criminals, but at the same time ensure that the public are reassured around their data, around privacy, around the ethical considerations. So I think that's a really important point made by John Finney. Lee MacArthur was right to, again, reference some of those human rights considerations. I think important to remind us that this bill didn't just come or materialise out of thin air. It came from a lot of hard work. Yes, by John Scott, but I think he was also right to reference his colleague Alison McInnes. I sat beside her at Justice Committee many moons ago, and of course she kept me right often in that committee. But she, of course, alongside many members, a champion of human rights. So from the conversations that Alison McInnes had when she was an MSP in this Parliament, right the way through to the good work that John Scott has done, this bill is really an accumulative effort by a lot of different actors from a lot of different political parties, and external to this Parliament, and we've got to a very strong place. Indeed, Rona Mackay made some excellent remarks around the independence of the Commissioner, and through the process of this legislation, I think we've strengthened that independence of the Commissioner, for example, in terms of the appointment of the advisory group. And Margaret Mitchell, to conclude, made some excellent points in and around the complaints process, which she has been the champion for and led on in relation to this bill. And she's right to make the point that I think the Scottish public will look towards the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner for when it comes to potential breaches of any code of practice, and therefore having that now in the bill and as a function of the Biometrics Commission, I think is an excellent place for us to be. So to conclude, Presiding Officer, I think we have an excellent bill. I really want to thank all of the opposition spokespeople and indeed all the officials that have been involved in this to get us to this stage, a very constructive, collaborative approach. But more important to that, regardless of the approach, we now at the end stage have a biometrics, or will have a biometrics commissioner with a code of practice that will hopefully give members of the public an absolute assurance that while we want the police and those involved in policing to invest in technology to keep our streets safe, they'll also be reassured, on the other hand, that their data and their biometrics data will have a regulatory framework around it that will protect their rights and take on board their ethical considerations. So, Presiding Officer, I'm delighted to move this bill in my name, and I look forward to receiving, I hope, unanimous support in a few seconds' time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill. A short pause before we move on to the next item of business.
Thank you very much. And the next item of business is consideration of motion 21153 in the name of Bill Bowman on the appointment of the Auditor General for Scotland. And could I call on Bill Bowman to speak to and move this motion?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the cross-party selection panel established by the Presiding Officer under our standing orders, I am speaking to the motion in my name to invite members of the Parliament to agree to nominate Stephen Boyle to Her Majesty the Queen for appointment as the Auditor General for Scotland. The Presiding Officer chaired the selection panel, and the other members were Keith Brown, Alison Johnson, Jenny Mara, Mike Rumbles and Shona Robertson. As members will be aware, the role of Auditor General is a very high profile and important one. The Auditor General is responsible for auditing £50 billion of public money. The report to the Scottish Parliament through the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee on the financial management and performance of public bodies in Scotland. They also report to other committees to discuss the key findings of their reports. The Auditor General works closely with the Accounts Commission and is supported by staff from Audit Scotland. In a year when Audit Scotland celebrates its 20th anniversary, it will have a new Auditor General. The panel's nominee, Stephen Boyle, who is sitting in the public gallery and who will be known to many of us who sit or have sat on the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee, a qualified accountant and a Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy. He joined Audit Scotland in 2013 as an audit director, having previously held senior roles in Glasgow Housing Association, Cube Housing Association and the Scottish Housing Regulator. The panel believes that Stephen will bring to the post professionalism, independence and integrity, and I'm sure that the Parliament will want to wish him every success in his new role. I would also like to mention the current Auditor General, Caroline Gardner, who will demit office on 30th of June this year. Caroline has achieved a significant amount during her 8-year term in office. She has successfully led and influenced Audit Scotland, which is recognised as a world-class audit organisation, and I'm sure the members will, like me, want to wish her all the very best for the future. Presiding Officer, I move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr Bowman. And the question on this motion will be put at decision time. I am minded now to accept a motion without notice to bring forward decision time to now. Could I invite the Minister for Parliamentary Business to move such a motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. So the question is that decision time be moved forward to now. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. So there are 3 questions today. The first question is that motion 21170 in the name of Ben Macpherson on the Local Government Finance Scotland Order 2020 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 21170 in the name of Ben Macpherson is yes 88, no 23. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 21174 in the name of Hamza Youssef on the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill at stage 3 be agreed, and members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 21174 in the name of Hamza Youssef is yes 110. There were no votes against, there were no abstentions. The motion is agreed and the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill is passed. And our final question is that motion 21153 in the name of Bill Bowman on the appointment of the Auditor General for Scotland be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and may I offer my congratulations to Mr Boyle. Thank you very much. That concludes decision time. We're going to move
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.